So, so Rinpoche said to review, and so I wanted to emphasize a little bit, I mean, for our discussion, the first point being that one about, because the part from what's called Lorig, right, it's from the teachings on mind and awareness and how perception works, right, because I think that was confusing to people when it was talking about the eye. There were a lot of different translation terms, right, the eye faculty, or the eye sense power, or the eye, and then it was a little bit confusing, but I think it's not a difficult subject, really. So let's, we'll focus on that. But first I just thought to say, the first thing Khenpo Rinpoche mentioned again, which he had mentioned in the first set of teaching on this, right, is, so the title of the text is Praise of Dharmadhatu, right? And Rinpoche said that in one way, Dharmadhatu can be taken as a synonym just for emptiness itself, right? But then in particular, it's taken as meaning the emptiness of the mind. Right? So in one way, it can be taken as any emptiness, right? The emptiness of any phenomenon, which means the ultimate nature of any phenomenon. But then in particular, it means the ultimate nature of the mind, which is the emptiness of the mind, right? And then Rinpoche mentioned that it's also, in that sense, it's also a synonym for Buddha nature, right? For our innate potential to become Buddha. And that's in part because, according to the Middle Way school, right, Nagarjuna's tradition, the emptiness of the mind is our Buddha nature. So there's the ultimate nature of your own mind is your Buddha nature. So in that sense, Dharmadhatu is a synonym for Buddha nature. And then also, actually, Rinpoche was kind of, he also mentioned that, in that sense, then also, Dharmadhatu can also be taken as having a similar meaning to Mahamudra. Right? Because in a sense, Mahamudra, the Panchen Lama, Losing Chokyi Gyaltsen says, right, that, ultimately Mahamudra, the technique of Mahamudra is meditating on the ultimate nature of your own mind. Right? It's meditating on the emptiness of your own mind. So in that sense, you're meditating on the Dharma. When you're practicing the definitive meaning of Mahamudra, you're meditating on the Dharmadhatu. Right? So it's not exactly a synonym, because in a sense Mahamudra is like a meditation, but it's on the Dharmadhatu itself, on the emptiness of your own mind. But okay, then let's focus a little bit on that point of the Lorig and of perception, right? That, because there were that whole series of verses, right, starting at 38. When it said that first verse, right, of that series, where it says, when the eye and form assume their right direction, or right the relation, appearances appear without a blur, since these neither arise nor cease, they are the Dharmadhatu, although they are imagined to be otherwise. And then there's a series of verses, right, one for each of the senses, so eye, ear, nose, and so on, all the way up to mind. And what I thought, so first of all, there were different different translations were used for that term, like so what Rinpoche was getting at, right, is that first of all, this is a teaching by Nagarjuna, right, and so one of Nagarjuna's, his main focus was teaching emptiness. Right? He taught many topics, but his primary focus was to teach emptiness, and the main reasoning he used to prove emptiness was dependent origination. Right? That things are dependently originated is a synonym for the fact that they're empty. And the fact that things are empty means they're dependently arisen. Right? So one version of dependent origination that he's getting at here is the dependent origination of perception. Right? And if you get through all six senses, then everything you perceive, right, is going to be proven to be empty. And so Nagarjuna here is presenting how perception is dependently arisen, and he begins with the visual perception, and then he'll go on to talk about the other kinds of perception. But the pattern, as Rinpoche said, the pattern for all six of these verses is the same pattern, right? So if we understand well, we'll use the example of visual perception, then we can apply that to the other kinds of perception once we understand that one well. So there are three factors needed for a perception, right? And there is like a dependent origination means it depends on something, right? So for an experience, a moment of visual perception to take place, right, there have to be three causes and conditions. That's the way you say it, right? So the first is, again, like sometimes Tashi was translating this one as eye faculty, sometimes as eye sense power. There were different terms that he used. I'll follow Jeffrey Hopkins, because he actually justifies his translation. He calls it eye sense power, the eye sense power. And he says, actually, they give their, he calls it power, first of all, because the word in Sanskrit, Indraya, or in Tibetan, Wangpo, they give their respective consciousness dominance or power with respect to certain kinds of objects, so they are called powers. So he actually gives a justification for that translation. So the power, they empower or allow the consciousness to perceive a certain kind of object. That's what he's saying. And so what's clear here, right? Remember Tashi was talking about like or Rinpoche was talking about like a subtle form. Right? So what they're talking about there is that they're just differentiating in this part of Buddhist description of perception, how in each sense power is similar. So what they're saying is that the sense power is not the eyeball, right? The eyeball is the organ, right? Which is in which the sense power resides. So there's like a gross organ, right, that's made of flesh, and what they're saying is that inside there, at the back of the eyeball, is what they're calling a subtle form, right? Which is where what receives the subtle let's sort of say it. Which is what they would say is which is what contacts the object. That's the term that they would use in Buddhist in this area of perception, right? So, so they're just differentiating, right, between the gross organ and something subtler inside the organ that allows perception to take place, right? And one way of talking about that is that, like, for example, a person can have an eyeball but be blind, right? So there has to be something that's functioning inside the eyeball that allows it to perceive, and that's what they're called. So what they say is it's a subtle form, and what they mean by subtle form is that you can't see it with the naked eye. Like, in other words, if you dissect an eye, you don't see that; it's too subtle in that sense to be seen without aid. So one thing that's needed, and in that sense, what they're getting at there is that's not one thing that's important is that's not a consciousness, right? That's a physical form. Does that make sense? Now, if you only have, right, the sense power, right, that doesn't mean you can perceive. Right? There also has to be an object to be perceived. Right? So that already you can see there's a dependent relationship there. Right? And if there's an object but no sense power, the person can't see. Right? So the person has no eyes. Even if there's an object there, they won't see it. On the other hand, if there's an object there, but if the person has eyes but there's no object to see, then they won't see. Right? So you can see these are two things that are required. One is a form, right? Because we don't see sound, right? We don't see smell. We see visual. We see what sort of forms, colors, and shapes. Right? Okay. So it's two out of the three things, right? One is an object, a visual form that has color and shape, and the other is this eye sense power. I'm going to pause there and just make a comment about the sense, just my own reflection for a minute about the sense power. Like, actually, for those of us who are brought up in a tradition of in the West, it's scientific. Actually, it's quite similar, isn't it? Like, in other words, scientists would say something quite similar, right? They would say it's not your the outer part of your eyeball. It's not it's the right. It's the what's it called, the cones and rods inside the eye, which are subtle, not visible. Like, if you, in other words, you need a microscope. Right? So it's quite similar in a sense, right? The same thing, right? It's not the floppy thing here that hears. It's the subtle eardrum. So in a sense, it's quite similar. Right? There's scientists would say something quite similar to what Buddhists are saying. They just use different terms. Yeah.
I actually had some teachings on this where they talked about, I guess it's in some scripture somewhere, where they talked about the shapes of the sense powers, and in the eye, it was in fact dry. It's sort of like the same description.
Yeah, he actually. Yeah, he described it. It's hard to understand because one Tibetan text says the eye sense power is in the shape of a zarma flower, but I don't know the shape of a zarma flower. That is quite difficult. Yeah.
On Friday, there was a question of whether there are 3 or 4 or 5 factors. You mentioned causes and conditions.
Okay, that was a different. Actually, it's not really. There are 3 factors, but then there's a 4. Well, if I describe it, hopefully it'll make it clear. Let me come back. Let me explain the process, and I think that'll clarify that because there aren't 5. That was the confusion.
Right, there was a confusion.
That got confusing.
I was confused too because there was a number of 3, then 4, and then 5.
Right.
But as you just said, I feel that they are 4. So I don't know if I'm.
We'll get to. Really, there'll be 4.
Yes.
And we'll get through. We'll explain what they are. And
Yes.
Yes, that's right. It should be 4.
Yes.
Because it's the so we got 2 so far, right? There's the eye sense power, right, and there's the visual object. That's 2, right? And then this was the one that got really confusing. I think is the third one. That's a you call it the third. You have to have all 3 of these as causes and conditions for an experience of an eye sense power to take place. And this is the one that was a little confusing. Is you have to have and again I'm going to use. There are different. Again, I think the best term is the immediately preceding moment of cognition. Tashi sometimes was calling it the immediately arising moment, and I think that was where it got confusing. And later, Tashi said, "Oh, this was a better translation." He agreed.
What was it again? Immediate?
Immediately preceding, right? It was what came before.
Yeah.
The immediately preceding moment of cognition. And what that means is this: so I'm going to give it. It's pretty simple, right? Whereas if you have a corpse, right, a recently deceased person, they could still have the subtle object, right, the sense power. You could put something right in front of their face, but they won't see it, right? Because if their consciousness already departed their body, for example, right, then they can't see anything because there's no consciousness there. Right? So to perceive, there has to be awareness, right? And so what this is getting at is that awareness is a continuum, right? Whereas each moment of awareness, the substantial cause, the thing that the next moment of awareness comes from, is the previous moment of awareness. Right? This is one in Dignaga, I think it is. That's his proof of past and future lives, right? That consciousness comes from a previous moment of consciousness and leads to the next moment of consciousness. And so, before you were born, there was actually consciousness in the womb, and so on. So the idea would be that there has to be an immediately preceding moment of awareness or consciousness in order for visual perception to take place. Does that make sense? So those are the 3 necessary preconditions. I want to explain a little bit about this immediately preceding moment of consciousness, just so it's clear. Is that doesn't have to be a visual consciousness, right? And that's what Rinpoche was getting at. So for example, let's say you're Rinpoche was saying there could be intention, right? So for example, let's say you're sitting at a restaurant waiting for your friend, right? And let's say you have your eyes closed and you're going, oh, I wonder where they are, right? And then you think, oh, I want to look, and then you look around, right? Now at that point, I'm just giving you an example, right? There was a mental consciousness, right? A mental conscious thing. I wish I could see my friend, right? Then you look to the door, right? So the immediately preceding moment of that, and then if you see your friend, you go, there they are, right? There's a record. And so if you see the sequence, right, in this sense, in terms of visual perception, this is why we get to 4 then. There has to be the 4 conditions or something. Or 3 conditions and a result, really, is the better way to say it. Right? So one necessary precondition is a preceding moment of consciousness. Now remember, that could be mental or it could be a perceptual consciousness, right? You could hear a sound and then turn and see something, right? But there has to be awareness coming before, because the awareness itself doesn't come from nothing, right? It's not self-arisen from nowhere. It has a cause. The main cause of awareness or consciousness is the previous moment of consciousness. But for it to be a visual consciousness, there also has to be the eye sense power and an object to see, right? Otherwise, if a blind person wants to, they have a consciousness, right? But they won't give rise to a visual consciousness because they don't have a functioning sense power. Does that make sense so far? Right, so there has to be these three necessary preconditions, right? A previous moment of consciousness, right? The eye sense power, and a visual object. And when those three conditions come together, then there's the fourth thing, which is the experience of visual there's a visual experience, right? Or the experience of a moment of visual consciousness. Let's call it that, right? So does that make sense? So those three necessary, and in a way, I was sometimes one easy way to think of this is let's say you want a plant, right? Like you want a tomato plant. Right? So you have to have a seed, right? The seed is the substantial cause of that tomato plant. Right? But is the seed enough? Like if you put a seed in a drawer, are you going to get tomatoes? No. Right? So you have to have other conditions, right? You have to have water, you have to have sunlight, you have to have, in that case, earth, right? At least those conditions, and air. You have to have quite a few conditions actually in that case, right? For the tomato plant to arise, right? And so in this sense, for an experience, for a moment of visual consciousness to arise, is similar. Like the metaphor I'm using is that the previous moment of awareness, the immediately preceding moment of cognition, that's like the seed, right? That's the main cause of a moment of awareness. But for that moment of awareness to be visual, there also has to be a visual object, and there has to be the two conditions, right? Are a visual object and a eye sense power. And if all those are present, then you can have this moment of visual awareness. So that makes sense. So those three. So does that answer your question? So the three necessary preconditions lead to the fourth thing, which is the result, which is that moment of visual awareness. And so, and that's why when Rinpoche was saying, there could be like intention, right? Well, the intention could be that immediately preceding moment of, or would be that immediately preceding moment of cognition, where the person's, just wanting to pay attention, for example, to something.
Okay, what about mental consciousness?
What are the three then?
Is it one of the three?
No, so a mental consciousness. So first, remember there are six verses here, right?
Yeah.
So there are six kinds of experiences. So with the ear, it's the ear sense power, a sound. That's there's even if you're listening very carefully, if there's no sound, you can't hear.
Yeah.
So it has to be and so on. There has to be the ear sense power, a sound, and a preceding moment of consciousness, right? Now with the mental consciousness, right? If you're so there's an experience, right, where you're not where your awareness is not on a mental object, right, like a thought. In that case, still there are those three, right? Actually, we can go to the verse about that. It says here, that's verse 43. It says, the phenomena that appear to a mental consciousness, the chief of them all, are conceptualized and then superimposed. When this activity is abandoned, phenomena's lack of self-essence is known. Knowing this, meditate on the Dharmadhatu. And so, the idea here is that what they say is that mental consciousness is, first of all, it's also a dependent arising, right? And what there has to be, first of all, there has to be. I asked. This is actually what on the drive home that night. I asked Ken Rinpoche about this because this is the one I wasn't sure of. In the sense of, I asked him, what's the mental sense power? Because it's not a physical. This is the one. There is an exception, right? And not an exception. It does have a mental sense power, but Rinpoche clarified this in the drive home because this is what I was wondering about. Is all the other five have what we called it a subtle physical form, right? The eye, ear, nose. The sense powers are subtle physical form. Rinpoche clarified the mental sense power is not physical. It's mental. It's mind. And so, but he said still we call it a mental sense power, even though it's not a physical object like the other ones are physical. He said the mental sense power is not physical. So still there has to be first of all there has to be a mental object, right? Which means there has to be a thought. And one thing that's important is that thought can be either. There has to be a mental object, right? So the mental object can either be a what's the way to say it? Like a thought about impermanence, right? For example, right, which is purely something we've thought about, right? Or it could be you're like thinking about something you just saw, right? So that obviously happens, right? Like so, that's what Rinpoche was giving an example. He said, so you see if you see an object, right, then you think, oh, that's really ugly. Right? At that point, you're relating to a mental concept about that object. Right? But there has to be an object of thought. That's first thing, right? That's one. Then Rinpoche said there has to be a mental sense power, and there has to be the immediately preceding moment of consciousness. One thing I asked Rinpoche, just because this was what I wasn't sure of, was like, I was saying, so if the mental sense power is mental, right? It's mind, it's not an object. Then I asked, what's the difference between the immediately preceding moment of consciousness and the mental sense power, right? Because it could seem like if it's mind, I said, well, maybe are those the same? Are those the same, or are those two different things? What was interesting was Rinpoche actually gave a slightly, when I asked him that, he gave a slightly different answer than, I was looking in Geshe Rabtin's book, and that they gave slightly similar but slightly different answers. Geshe Rabtin seemed to be saying that they're the same, like that the immediately preceding moment of cognition and the mental sense power. He said something that he was kind of identifying those two. Rinpoche said that it depends, because he said let's say if the immediately preceding moment of a mental cognition is also a mental cognition, then there's only one thing, right, that gives rise to the next. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. But he said if sometimes the immediately preceding moment of consciousness for a mental sense power is could be a visual experience. And he said if it's a visual experience, then there are two actually, because there's always mind, there's always the mental consciousness there. So Rinpoche was saying, so if you see something, right, there's both there's a visual consciousness and a mental consciousness. He said, so then you can actually differentiate those. One can be one could be the mental sense power, and the other can be the immediately preceding moment of consciousness. So it depends, but Rinpoche said there's always an immediately preceding moment. Does that make sense?
So what if there is no object?
What's that?
What if there is no object?
What does that mean? Like no object of mental consciousness?
Yeah, like, I mean, it's just mental consciousness. I mean,
I guess the idea, one thing that's interesting in like, so take for example, like take for example what Rinpoche, remember yesterday where Rinpoche was talking about like the form and formless realms. Right? Rinpoche taught about that. And so this is an interesting point in Buddhist psychology, I guess you would call it, is that in a sense there's always an object actually, like, and actually Bob Thurman clarifies that he speaks about that very nicely, where he says like sometimes people say I'm thinking about nothing, for example, and he says that idea of nothingness is an object, actually, is an idea of nothingness, right? And that's where the formless realms, right? One of them is infinite space, for example, right? Like there's no, so the person, in a sense, there's no specific object, right? There's no objects like what we perceive, but there's some subtle concept of space, right? And still, like there's a subtle dualism also for that person. That's what Buddhist psychology is, very subtle at that point, right? But there's still a subtle sense of there's an I, a self that's perceiving space, or there's an idea, there's a subtle I that's perceiving nothingness. And so in that sense, even if you have this idea, like so, if the person could be, in our sense, it's very conceptual, but even they with this like deep concentration, so they have this deep absorption concentration on nothingness, for example, right? But one point is that there's still a subtle sense of an I perceiving nothing, and that's still an object of consciousness, and so that's part of why. And that's one of the reasons why they're not liberated from samsara at that point, is that there's still a subtle grasping at true existence, actually, right? At a truly existent nothing, which is funny in a way, right? So in other words, somebody creates an idea of nothing, right? But then they say that nothing's real. Like the feeling, it was due to beginningless familiarity with grasping at true existence. Even if the person comes up with some subtle idea of nothing, they reinforce or reify or sort of hold that nothing to be truly existent. And therefore they are still in samsara, so they're still an object of the mind at that point.
So is that because they miss then the So they missed on the wisdom, really. They missed that part.
Yeah, they didn't understand Nagarjuna's teaching on emptiness, right?
Right, yeah, they
Yeah.
missed that part.
Yeah, they just missed it. They didn't understand it.
And that's why then they have to come back.
Yeah, eventually they fall back. Yeah, to,
Because they'll never
desire.
get there if they don't get the teachings and they don't realize that. Right.
yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Wow, yeah, that's good to have that in my frame.
Yeah, and that's why they say, like, it doesn't, you can't, it's not or not, that's why these teachings by Nagarjuna are so important, right, is that's what they say, is that even if you, that's why, like in the Lam Rim, they talk about how, you've achieved those formless realms infinite times, you've achieved been in a formless realm, God, infinite times, and the trick is we didn't understand emptiness, right? And that's why they say it's only through understanding emptiness that you can be liberated
It's huge, isn't
from
it?
samsara, and there's no other way. And it's hard, right? Because even the peak, what Ken Rinpoche talked about, right? The four, even like to the peak of samsara, that there's still this subtle grasping at an I that's experiencing the peak, the
Right.
bliss or peak or whatever that is,
It's quite so.
beyond happiness and not happiness. It's like some state like that. But there's still a sense of grasping at an I that's experiencing that truly exists, and therefore the person, as long as you have that grasping at an I, right? And like Rinpoche said, then eventually there will definitely be a sense of other,
Right.
and then there will be a sense of mine and yours,
Right.
and then all the afflictions will come
It
back.
starts good.
So if you don't completely destroy that sense of truly existent I, or inherently existent I, then you can't be liberated. No matter how deep your concentration is, no matter how much you meditate on, right, like whether you meditate on, and that's what's tricky, right, because even, this is one thing that, as we say it, like if you read like Lama Tsongkhapa's explanations about Nagarjuna's teaching and Chandrakirti, he says that even many Buddhists actually, when you get these experiences, they mistake that for emptiness. He says, but, so he points out it's important not to make a mistake on that point. Because like, I guess sounds like, actually there's a funny part, I'll share that, it's funny, I was reading it the other day where, like, yesterday Ken Rinpoche was talking about like at that level, the great level of the path of accumulation, people can talk to statues. So then there came a point in Lama Tsongkhapa's biography where he wasn't talking to statue, but he could see Manjushri and talk to Manjushri. First it was like through one of his teachers and friends, who was Lama Umapa, and then later he could actually talk to Manjushri himself. There's a funny part where he says to Manjushri, he had like some deep meditative experiences, right? Lama Tsongkhapa himself had, right? There was one time when he was like part of a group and they were reciting some teaching on emptiness, and he just entered into like a samadhi and couldn't move. Everybody else got up and left, and he was just. And finally, I think they had to come and say, "Hey, what's going on here?" And he said, like to Manjushri, "Is that experience that I had? Is that the view of Chandrakirti? Is that the highest view, the consequentialist, the prasangika, or is that the view of the more dogmatic empty? It's still Nagarjuna's." And Manjushri said, "Neither one. It's not any. It's not even a view of emptiness. Like you're not there yet, basically, right?" And then Manjushri taught him, and then Lama Tsongkhapa eventually realized emptiness perfectly, according to the conventional view. So he was talking to Manjushri like that, right? But so even Lama Tsongkhapa was pointing out from his own experience that even Buddhists, right, can mistake some other meditative. I think one way you could take that all as a teaching.
Yeah, it would be easy if you haven't penetrated that.
Yeah. So that's why I think Lama Tsongkhapa told that story as a way of teaching us.
Mm.
That
There's a
it's
difference.
easy to mistake the view of emptiness for some other experience. Yeah.
Then emptiness is something really, really very difficult to grasp because nothing actually means something. So where's emptiness? Emptiness is really so fine, it's so far away, it's so subtle. It's really very difficult for
Except-
us, for practitioners to.
First of all, I totally agree with you, but also remember, Nagarjuna says it's not far away, it's also not close. Remember, Nagarjuna said that. he said it's not far away, it's also not close by, right? But it's very difficult. Yeah. Yeah, it's a very difficult point. Well, actually, I wanted to relate now that we understand, right, this idea that there are three preconditions, right? Because I want to go back to that, because I think you just had to know those things, like, there was, I'll say this too, like, in a sense, right, that idea of, like actually I was talking to Tashi, and he was saying like this idea of perception, right, how perception works, the eye sense power, the object, the immediately preceding moment of cognition, and then the result of the moment of awareness. Like, you know, in a text like this, right, that Nagarjuna was writing at, you know, as a, I mean, remember he was a pandit, right, from Nalanda. I mean, his audience here was clearly other Buddhist scholars, right? Whereas you can see he's not writing this text. Yeah, he wrote a letter to a king that was clearly, you read it and you can see it's aimed at a king. This is obviously not aimed at people who don't know anything about Buddhism, right? And what I was going to say was Tashi was saying that, like, you know, for example, at Sarah Monastery, that he studied this stuff, like the perception process, when he was 13, 14 years old.
Wow.
So this would be like a basic understanding, in a similar way to how, like, you know, like in American schools, right, a kid would grow up and at a certain point you study, well, there's light waves and they hit your eyeball, you know, like, it's part of your educational system, right? So this is part of the, you know, basic Buddhist educational system as somebody's growing up. So Nagarjuna is not teaching this here to teach people that there's eye sense power, an object, whereas his audience, he's assuming that you already know that, in a sense. So we have to learn it so that we know it, so then we can understand Nagarjuna's main point, right? Which is not, he's not just teaching, this is like, in Tibetan, right, we lorik. Right? I mean, this is not a teaching on lorik, there are other teachings on that. This is assuming an understanding of that, which we now need, we need it, right, in order to then understand what Nagarjuna is really getting at, right? So when he says, let's go back to the eye, right? When the eye and form, right? So here it really should be eye sense power. Verse 38. Because he's teaching about emptiness actually in this verse, right? All these verses are teaching about emptiness. So now we can go back. So if we understand verse 38, when the eye, which means the eye sense power, right, and form, assume their right relationship. Appearances appear, right? So he's implying, right? There are the three preconditions, right? There's the form, there's the eye sense power, and there's the preceding moment of consciousness, the immediately preceding moment of consciousness. And when those three assume their right relationship, right? When they're all present, then appearances appear, right? That's what he's saying, right? Now comes the real, the point of his verse, right? Since these neither arise nor cease, they are the Dharmadhatu, although they are imagined to be otherwise. Right? And so, actually, what Nagarjuna is teaching here, right, is dependent origination and emptiness, right? So what does it mean, though? This is what, again, you know, you're saying it's difficult, right? In a sense, what he's saying is, since appearances arise, they don't arise. Right? In a sense, that's what, you know, in a sense, that seems to be what Nagarjuna is saying, right? Since they're dependently arisen, based on causes and conditions, they're not arisen. And that's not, first of all, I want to say that's obviously not easy to understand. And I wanted to actually quote, right? I wanted to quote actually another text by Nagarjuna. This is from Nagarjuna's Treatise on the Middle Way. It's getting at a similar point. I just want to, it's more, it's a little longer. So at the beginning of the Treatise on the Middle Way, right? Actually, this is Majjhimaka Karika. He says, I bow down to the perfect Buddha, the best of propounders, who taught that what dependently arises has no cessation, no production, no annihilation, no permanence, no coming, no going, no difference, no sameness, is free of elaborations of inherent existence and duality, and is at peace. So he's getting at a very, I mean, these are two different verses by Nagarjuna. They're getting a very similar point. And I'll quote one more. I just think this is important because it's relating. This is the main point of this whole section. So this is actually the Buddha teaching in his Question of the King of the Nagas. So it's from a sutra. Those which are produced from causes are not produced. They do not have an inherent nature of production. Those which depend on causes are said to be empty. Those who know emptiness are aware. So that's actually the Buddha, right? And then Nagarjuna is essentially teaching, right, based on the Buddha's teaching, teaching of the Buddha.
So then the merely arising label is the result.
Right, and that's difficult, isn't it? It's difficult to understand that. Because, and I want to say, so like, let's look at this though, because a lot of times actually, what's interesting is that all the schools, like, of Nagarjuna's teachings, right? So they're like when Lama Tsongkhapa like sort of sometimes talks about the tenet systems, right? So there are like there are 4 different tenet systems, and within those there are subdivisions, right? So like for example in the Vaibhashikas, that's the lowest of the 4 from Tibetan perspective, and there are 18 sub-schools of those, but they sort of summarize a certain way of looking at things. And then there are the followers of Sutra, right? The Sautantrikas, then the mind-only school, and then the middle way. Right? And then in the middle way school, there's even a differentiation, right, between Chandrakirti's view of what Nagarjuna was teaching and the view of others, right? Other people who also were followers of Nagarjuna, but from the perspective of, but in a sense, like still grasped at something very subtle. Let's put it that way. They were followers of Nagarjuna, but it said that Chandrakirti was the person who most accurately. And actually, that was all Tibetan traditions seem to agree on that. They all respect Chandrakirti very highly. And actually, Lama Tsongkhapa, when he had those visions of Manjushri, it was Manjushri who told him, Chandrakirti is the person who explained Nagarjuna's teaching most flawlessly. So he said, if you want to realize emptiness, rely on the teachings of Chandrakirti.
Could you read the first quote?
The one by Nagarjuna?
From
or-
the treatise on the middle way, yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Could you read it?
So he said, I bow down to the perfect Buddha, the best of propounders. And actually, by the way, it's very similar, right? When on the day Lama Tsongkhapa realized emptiness, right? He wrote praise to Buddha for teaching dependent origination, which is very similar praise to this praise, right? To Nagarjuna's praise. So he says the best of propounders who taught. So he's praising him for what, right? He's not praising him for having light rays shooting out of his body. He's not praising him for having, for being handsome. He's not praising him for being smart. He's praising him for teaching dependent origination. Right? So he says that what dependently arises has no cessation, no production, no annihilation, no permanence, no coming, no going, no difference, no sameness, is free of elaborations. And then actually Jeffrey Hopkins adds this clause, of inherent existence and of duality. In other words, that's implied from later. So he adds that there. And is at peace. You can see it's very similar to what Nagarjuna is saying in this text. That's why I was quoting it. Is that you can see actually all those points are actually covered in the praise of Dharmadhatu. It's just it's very pithy piece there.
It's like the Heart Sutra at the same time, right?
What's that?
It's like the Heart Sutra.
There's no, in the sense of negating, negating. Yeah, and actually, sometimes it's said, right, when they do the interpretable, when Lama Tsongkhapa teaches, differentiating the interpretable, or like to be interpreted and the definitive teachings of Buddha, he says the definitive teachings of Buddha are in this format. There's no this, no that. Like the Heart Sutra, like this verse of Nagarjuna's would be considered a definitive teaching because it's explicitly teaching emptiness. And what Lama Tsongkhapa says is that all the other teachings of the Buddha could be correct. In other words, they could be literally correct teachings, but they're not teaching the definitive meaning, right, which is emptiness. So, for example, he gives the example of a teaching on karma, right, that generosity leads to abundance. Right? So that's literally true, but it's not definitive in the sense that it's not teaching explicitly that dependent origination shows that giving is empty, the receiver is empty, the gift is empty. That's the definitive level of teaching. The other is more to be interpreted in the sense that it's still correct, but it's not teaching the ultimate truth, which is emptiness. So, so it's the same, similar to the Heart Sutra, which is definitive teaching. Okay, but let's go back. So what does that mean, though? So going back to verse 38, right? So when these 3 factors are present, then there's this appearances appear, right? So there's a moment of visual consciousness. since these neither arise nor cease. Which in a sense, if you're because this is what I was getting at earlier when I was starting to say there are all the other schools, right? So all the other schools would say, any school other than the middle way school, would say something there is, for appearances to appear, right? For dependent origination to work, something has to be truly existent, right? In other words, they would say, how could a thing that's not, they would say for something to produce a result, right, it has to be a cause. And for that cause to produce a result, it has to be real. Right? It has to truly exist. It has to be inherently existent. Otherwise, how could it produce a cause? Right? And the Nagarjuna says the exact opposite. He says something that were truly existent and inherently existent could never produce a cause. It would always be what it is. If it inherently existed as something, it would always remain that. And it couldn't transform into something else. Right? So Nagarjuna says it can't have inherent existence, or it would or in other words, the fact that it produces a cause proves that it doesn't have an inherent existence. Other philosophers would say the fact that it produces a cause proves it does have inherent existence. So they're completely the opposite. So when he says neither arise nor cease, he's being very radical in that sense, right? He's actually, and you can see this is why I said it. He's addressing other. Actually, here I think he's addressing mostly he's explaining this to other Buddhists who even, and to anybody who would grasp at, they don't have to be Buddhists, but to anybody who grasps at inherent existence or real existence, who grasps at true arising and true cessation. So then Khenpo Rinpoche said this, so let's clarify, right? It doesn't mean things don't arise at all, right? That would be a misinterpretation, right? Some people, and there are Buddhist scholars who misunderstood Nagarjuna and thought he was, when he says either arise nor cease, is important to understand, right? Some people read that verse and said, well, that means things don't arise at all and nothing exists. Right? But that's nihilism, which is a wrong view. So, and that's why he says appearances appear without a blur, and then he says these never arise nor cease. Right. So, whereas if he's saying appearances appear, you can't say he means nothing arose at all, because it's clear that would be a nihilistic view, a view that nothing exists. Right. So what he's really saying here, right, is that when he says, although they are imagined to be otherwise, right, is that because things depend upon those causes and conditions, they don't have inherent nature. Right? They don't have an inherent nature as being what they are. Right? So if a moment of visual perception, right, is only an appearance, right? He says an appearance dependent on these causes and conditions, then it doesn't exist inherently as what it appears to be. Right? And the idea here is that we grasp, right? And this is what Nagarjuna is implying, right? That we are always grasping at things as if they were inherently what they appear as, right? And which means they appear to us as truly existent, right, or as inherently existent. And the Nagarjuna is saying that's not correct, right? And so even even arising, right, like because Khenpo Rinpoche said this very clearly before also, and all the teachers say this, right, that whatever ordinary beings perceive, right, or Khenpo Rinpoche was differentiating ordinary beings from those who have seen emptiness directly, which means Aryas, right? And that's the main differentiation. There are mainly like three categories. There's ordinary beings, there's Aryas, and there's Buddhas. Right? So somebody who's seen emptiness directly doesn't do this. But for ordinary beings like us, whenever we perceive something, we imagine it to be other than it is, right? We always are overly, we're seeing things as truly existent or as inherently existent. Does that make sense? All the time. And so even arising, right? When we think of arising, we think that's real. We think something truly arose in the sense of that it has its own inherent nature, or its own inherent, that it exists from its own side. That's what I was saying. Right? And what Nagarjuna is saying is that's not correct. Right? So things do have mere appearance, right? They appear like and then later he'll say, like a magician's illusion. Right? But a magician's illusion doesn't have, right? They often give that example, right? If a magician creates an illusory appearance of a woman, well, there's no woman there, right? There's an appearance of a woman, but there's no actual woman there. And he's saying it's similar, right? This is similar in the sense that it appears as though there's a real, something real, right? Actually, it appears to us that there's a real perceiver, a real perceived, a real act of perceiving, right? And all those are substantially and truly existent, but they're not. That's what he's saying. And actually, maybe it's okay. Is it okay if I keep going with this a little further? Like, I want to also get at something Kent Rinpoche said yesterday. Right? So one thing I thought I remember Tashi almost like laughed, right? Because Rinpoche, Tashi did sort of chuckle, right? Because Rinpoche explained first. Remember, Rinpoche gave a whole explanation, and then he said that's the gross level of, and then Tashi said the gross level, right? And then Rinpoche said yes, the gross, right? So let's differentiate that, right? Because the gross level is easier than the subtle level, right? So let's do the gross level first. Like that's why Rinpoche did it that way, right? Is Rinpoche wants this, whereas why they teach a grosser level of selflessness is that it's easier to understand than the subtle level, right? And that's useful because it's hard to grasp, as you said, right? So the gross level that Rinpoche actually very clearly explained was the gross level in the middle way school is that things lack like either a nature, or you can say a self, right? That's unitary, permanent, and independent. Okay, so that's one. That's gross, right? Is that they lack that kind of self. Unitary, permanent, and independent. That's the gross level of selflessness. Is that they lack. That was what Rinpoche was saying yesterday. They lack that kind of self, right? A unitary, permanent, independent self. And so let's think about it for a moment, right? Like, there's just to because this is not it's not something mystical, really, right? Whereas if you're like, so think about it this way, right? If you're like, I'll give my earlier example using visual perception, right? Like, so if you're sitting in a restaurant and your friend is late, right? You're waiting for your friend and they're late. And you don't have whatever, they didn't text you or call or something, right? So you don't know what's going on. You're maybe worried about them or worried what's going to happen. And so you're thinking, wow, you're like, so you have this. Let's go through it, right? So you have a thought. I hope they're okay. I wonder if they're all right. I wonder if they forgot. I wonder if they got in an accident, right? Whatever. You're having different thoughts, right? So that's your stream of. Those are mental moments of mental consciousness, right? That have an object, and that object in this case is your friend and these worries about your friend. And you keep looking over towards the door, right, the entrance to the restaurant, to see if they come in, and you look, they're not there, and you have another thought, right? So actually, you're going back, right, it's a stream of consciousness, right? Whereas awareness is always a stream, right? It's a mental continuum, technically, you say, right? So there's a moment of mental consciousness, right? I wonder if they're there, and you look, you don't see them, right? Then, I wonder if they're okay, and you look again, right? And so I'm just giving an example, right? And then there comes a point, right, where you think, I hope they're going to make it. And you look and you see your friend. Right? So think of your experience at that moment. Right? You see your friend's face across the room and their body there, right? At what's it called, like where walking into the restaurant. Right? So now pause for a moment and think of that moment. Right? Already, actually, even before you, right? That's a moment of visual. That at this point, it's a moment of visual consciousness. But as Kent Rinpoche said, right? Moments of visual consciousness are visual, but they're accompanied by mental awareness, and then subsequent to that will come a mental awareness, more purely cognition, right, like thoughts. But so at that moment already, right, this is what the Nagarjuna's tradition says. Already, you perceive that person as though they're independent, right? Or this is true, right? Whereas you say, "There's my friend," right? And you don't think. There are a bunch of parts that I'm labeling my friend, right? You don't think there's a mere appearance of my friend, right? You think that's my friend, right? And already even visually though, there's a sense of actually, if you check even your visual awareness, right? Think back to that moment, right, when you have those kinds of experiences. You can make up your own, but if you want, but it's a similar idea, right? There's a sense of like actually at that moment, right? You're even your eye focused on that person, right? And there's a sense of what's the word? Already there's a sense of true existence. That's the word, right? There's a sense that that's truly them, right? They're really there. Definitely there's that experience, right? And then you have thoughts, right? Subsequent to that, you have cognitions about them, right? Oh, good, they're here. Something like that, right? And clearly, if you get more subtle, right? Actually, first there's this visual sense that they're real and they're there. And then there's a sense of them, and then of course, then after that there's thoughts, my friend. Oh, my friend is here. Right? So there's a sense of I and mine. Right? And again, it seems real, right? There's no sense of they're merely labeled my friend, or, there's a bunch of body parts, and there's an eyeball and a hair, and and then I'm saying friend based on that, or we're not thinking anything of that. We're saying, right? Even the visual awareness is like, visual awareness sees them as real and there, and then there's a sense of, then after that there's thoughts, my friend, right? And there's a sense of I'm real and they're real, and we have this real, solid relationship. That's something that actually exists, right? At that moment you don't think friend is just a concept, right? There's a feeling there that's very solid, like that's me and that's my friend. So let's first look at just this gross level, right? So on that level, right, you don't think, right? So when you see let's use the example of the friend for now, right? So first of all, you don't think, I'm going to go in the reverse order, dependent, right? We think they're, we said independent is one of the three characteristics, right? So again, you're definitely not, at that moment, you check your own experience, if you think back, right? You're definitely not thinking, there's a bunch of parts that I'm labeling friend. Definitely not, right? You think, that's my friend. Really, right? So there's not a sense, it seems like they exist independently of their parts, right? It feels like that, right? They exist really there, and you don't have any concept that there's parts involved, actually. They seem to be unitary, actually, right? There's one thing, my friend. Right? And also at that time, actually, these are gross associations, but it seems to you as though that's their nature, actually, right? That their nature is person and friend, right? And it seems to you as if there's a singular thing there, and it really does seem like it's permanent, right? You don't feel like, well, actually they used to be, it doesn't feel at all, and you don't even perceive them as if, well, they used to be a stranger, maybe they were my enemy at some point, or they could be in the future. There's no, your perception is that all those things are in, like, substantially there in the nature of that visual, all it is, right? I mean, actually, now all that happened was a visual, right? All that actually happened, right, was there was a sense power, an object, a preceding moment of consciousness, right? But in that moment, think of all the things, right, that are going, we're so naive, we don't notice any of this, right? That's because we're not, we haven't seen emptiness yet, right, directly. And so there's this sense right now of this unitary, really it is like that, right? Singular means, like, right? There's that feeling. There's a unitary, permanent, independent thing there, and then there's also a unitary, right? There's me, right? I'm also singular, I'm unitary, I'm real, I'm permanent, like I'm here, right? And they're there, and there's a sense of, what's the word? And there's no feeling of dependent origination, right? There's a sense of solidity and permanence there, right? So one thing you can easily start to see, though, is that those are, right, if you go back to Nagarjuna's verse, they are imagined to be otherwise, right? Or so we're imagining these things, let's say the visual, right, the person, we're imagining them to be singular, unitary, permanent, independent, right? That's our imagining, but it's wrong, actually, right? There's those, we can easily see if we analyze it. Are they permanent? No, right? Or is their body, everything about their body is impermanent, right? We know that, right? Everything about their consciousness is impermanent, right? We can, or the nature of consciousness is always changing, moment to moment, right? So clearly they're impermanent, right? Is there a unitary thing, right? Well, actually, you can analyze easily, right? They have a nose, ear, the visual, right? If you break down the visual perception, right? Is there something that's, is there something unitary that's will? Well, so, there's hair, but if like she shaved off her hair and I had it and I took it home, could I say I'm taking will home? No, obviously not, right? That would be silly, right? And so on, right? Is Will's left nostril will? Can I find will there? No. And so it seems like there's something independent of the parts, right? But actually, the person exists in dependence upon their parts, right? So there's not a unitary. Does that make sense? So we're just going through. So you can see if you analyze. The point is you have to use reasoning, right? Ken Rinpoche said that, right? Whereas because we have this habituation to, from beginningless time, to ignorance, grasping at a true existence or an inherent nature, in this case, a gross level of self, we have to counter that with reasoning. And eventually, right? So when, and anyway, so if you counter that with reasoning, eventually you have some recognition. Wow, that's not actually that self that I'm imagining to be there is not there. And that recognition, right, is in a way, in a sense, you could say. Actually, let's go back because I just want to say one more thing about that. Right. One thing that Lama Tsongkhapa clarifies very clearly is you have to identify clearly the object you're refuting. Right? So in other words, which is, in this sense, right, it's an independent, permanent, unitary self. Right? And then through reasoning, you realize there is no permanent. Let's just use the easiest one of all of those, permanent. Right? Is there a permanent self of will? It's easy to prove. Right? There's no such thing as a permanent. Right? And when you prove that, right, so if you're, then you can say, well, okay, will is empty of having a permanent self. Right? So that's one kind of emptiness, right? Now there's a problem there still. This is what Nagar's getting at, right? Is if I meditate like that, I say, okay, I have my object of negation right now is going to be a permanent self of will, right? So I bring up my sense of, like I've known Will for 17, we just figured out yesterday, 17 years or something, right? So I could say, well, I've known her for 17 years, right? When I think that, immediately there's some concept of permanence, as if there was somebody who 17 years ago and now was the same in some way. Right? That's actually not true. Right? But there's a sense of permanence there, right? So now if I meditate and I say, well, her hair looks different, her face looks a little different, her mind is different, all the parts of her have changed in 17 years, right? So my sense of something permanent that's solid is a construction in my mind. It doesn't actually exist there, right? If that's a made up, right? There's a name, will, right? And there are parts, and there's that are ever changing, right? But I've sort of constructed, when I say, oh, I knew her for 17 years, she's my longtime friend, right? There's some sense of permanence, right? But if I meditate, I can realize will is empty of a permanent self, right? And that's one kind of emptiness, but there's a problem still, right? When I say will is empty of a permanent self, already I've thought, but there is a real will there from her own side that's empty of a permanent. See what I mean? So that's why it's gross. You see what I mean? That's why those are gross levels of. That's why it's still gross, is that I haven't really uprooted the root problem, but I'm getting closer. Does that make sense? So it's useful to refute the permanent self, and that's easy, right? If you really meditate, you can see, okay, this person has no permanent self. But watch your own mind, right? You're still grasping. For sure, if we haven't realized emptiness, right? If I say this person's empty of a permanent self, already I'm grasping at this person, but still they're real from their own side. They just don't have a permanent self. So that's why that's gross. Still, we have to refute something more subtle if we want to actually liberate ourselves from samsara. Does that make sense? Otherwise, what happens, right? If I say will's empty of a permanent self, but I still grasp at something about will, then so that I think, okay, will's not permanent. But then if will hits me, then I'll get angry, right? Fine, she's not permanent, but she shouldn't hit me. What's wrong with her? Because there's still some grasping at a real will existing from her own side. So you see why one is gross, but there's still something subtle we're grasping at.
I seem to understand more, but I still grasp. That's the problem. But back to verse 38,
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if I understand correctly. But the three causes, and then the result is the appearances.
Mm-hmm.
And the appearances appear, but they do not arise and they do not cease because they are not themselves. They are parts of causes and conditions. And so what I should think is otherwise, differently. They are not there. They do not exist, but they are only parts of the process, and therefore they are imagined. They should be imagined to be otherwise. That is, they are empty, and that is Dharmadhatu, which is emptiness.
Well, let's look at that, right? So actually now, because I did permanent, now let's look parts, right? Because you're raising a good question. So let's analyze that, right? So, because in a sense, well, let's look at it that way, right? So like so I just did the permanent one, right? So Will's okay, I'll keep using your example, right? So one thing is I could say she's not permanent, right? But now let's do what you said, right? So she's also, that's getting at independent, right? So if I say, like in other words, and actually for me, oftentimes, again, you can check in your own experience, but sometimes this sense of unitary and independence seem to go together, right? There's a single person who's will, and I don't feel like, if I don't analyze it, it doesn't seem like she's dependent upon her parts, right? And also it doesn't seem like my experience of her is dependent upon the eye conscious, the eye sense power, a visual stimulus, and a preceding moment of awareness, right, or consciousness. It just seems like she's there, right? And so, yes, we can analyze on parts, right? So one is we can say, well, there is an eye sense power, right? And there is a visual stimulus, and then there is a preceding moment of consciousness. And based on that, there's a mere appearance. That's clearly true, right? There's just a mere appearance, right? And so check, right? So then what, let's pause there, right? So it is refuting something, right? You have to first get at the object of refutation, right? Which is like, in a sense, the object of refutation in this sense is that there's a real object, a real subject, and a real act of perceiving, right? And it seems like those are solid, but if we analyze, right, they're merely apparent. There is no independent or solid perceiver, perceived, or active perceiving. The question that's interesting, right? So yes, in one sense that's true, right? And so it proves that those are empty of inherent existence, or actually it proves those are empty. Actually, I'm wrong. I would say it proves that those are empty of independent existence, right? Whereas they only arise dependently. So it's disproving that they have any independent existence. One question that is a useful meditation, right? Because we're disproving independence, right? But what Rinpoche was saying, and I think this is why Tashi said what for a moment, interestingly, right, is that that's still gross. In this way, actually, I'll say why, is it's easy then though to still we could still grasp if it's possible, a person then could still grasp, but still, and actually some Buddhist philosophers do this, but still the eye's sense power has its own nature. Its own, it still exists from its own side, right? Still the object exists from its own. They're dependent, but it still seems like they have some nature from their own side. Let's call it that. Does that make sense? So that's more subtle, right? So I could say, yes, the visual object, the eye sense power, and the preceding moment of consciousness have a dependent relationship, right? And then they give rise to, based on dependent origination, they give rise to a moment of visual perception that's not independent. It's dependent on these things, right? So in that sense, that is quite good, actually, right? That's very helpful, because already we're refuting something, a kind of ignorance, grasping at independence, right? So that's quite significant at that point, right? And many Buddhist philosophers would stop at that point. What Rinpoche was pointing out yesterday is there's still something more subtle, right? Because he was saying that's a correct. He explained that because it's a correct explanation, but then Rinpoche said then there's something more subtle than that. Does that make sense? So that's important to understand, and this is why you can see how it's easy for some, especially if somebody's meditating on that deeply and then has some experience of that. You can see how it'd be very hard to say, that's very profound, actually, right? And that is a kind of correct understanding. Or you say, but there's even more subtle understanding to be achieved. And you can see how now you can see it's easy to see why practitioners, it's hard to realize the most subtle level of emptiness then, isn't it? So does that make sense then, to answer your question? So that is a correct understanding, right? It's important to understand that. There is refuting independent perception, right, or an independent self is profound and important, but there's still something more subtle, a more subtle level of grasping to be refuted still.
For me to be practical in daily life, I want to make it simple, and so all the people are walking karma to me, and that's how we function. And when I go meet a friend, my intention, and then I come back to, is that what he meant by intention? My intention is to make this a useful meeting or whatever, a conversation or...
That's actually two different, just to clarify, there's two different things. Like one is, I mean, they're both intention, but just to clarify, what you're doing is correct, first of all, definitely, right? Like in other words, you're setting the motivation of compassion.
Yeah, it's a motivation.
Or that's an intention, motivation is a kind of intention, right? And so that's good practice, right? That's like setting bodhicitta motivation, right? That's that's the best practice, right? And the Guardian says that in here too later. But what Rinpoche was getting at when he talked about intention yesterday in terms of perception was something more simple, even more basic than that, which is just like, so that's correct practice, but here Rinpoche was just talking about independent relationship. In other words, like something very basic, like if I'm looking down and then I look over there, like it's because I want to see Penma, right? That kind of intent. He was just talking about intention of like a visual, that simple, like something very, very simplistic, like if I have my eyes closed and then if I had a question, I might go like that, because I have some intention to see Pema, and then I open my eyes and look or something and I see Pema. So he was just talking about the very simple level of that, in that, so he was talking about in the immediately preceding moment of consciousness, right? That, just before the experience of the visual consciousness of Pema, there's an intention to see Pema. Right. He was giving that as an example. He was saying that could be one kind of immediately preceding moment of consciousness, could be intention. Like I want to see Pema, like that. Okay. So he was like very simplistically in that way about...
that's what I'm asking, because
No, that's why it's good, that's why we're discussing. So at least in that moment that he was, Rinpoche certainly talked about, many times about setting the intention of bodhicitta, but here he was just talking about this very simplistic, that could be the nature of the immediately preceding moment could be intention, right? Which would be like, I intend to look. Something like that.
Right, yeah.
But actually, so let's Rinpoche did talk about it, so let's just talk briefly then. So you can see how, like, in a way, we have to understand those gross levels that are not that gross, actually, compared to other, those are subtle from other schools' points of view, but from the middle way school, that's gross. Does that make sense? From other schools' point of view, that's what the middle way is calling the gross level of selflessness. Other Buddhist schools would actually call very subtle. It's just that the middle way school is the most subtle of all the schools, especially Chandrakirti's way of describing it. So, in the Garjana system, as described by Chandrakirti, then, this is where Khenpo Rinpoche was using the term inherent existence, right, or inherent nature, which is a different term than independent nature, right? And so that term of inherent existence, right? That was the term she used, which only in Chandrakirti says only Chandrakirti makes that a synonym for true existence. Does that make sense? So there's other schools called, like Bhava Viveka and other middle way scholars talk about true existence also, but Chandrakirti identify uniquely in a way, except for his followers, uniquely identify true existence with inherent existence or inherent nature. And that means, right, so what is inherent nature? Like one way to describe it is it means having a nature that exists from its own side, right? Or having a nature that exists inherent to the object, to that thing. Right? And that's refuted by, you can refute that using the reasoning of dependent origination, right? But that's a more subtle, that's more subtle than just saying, like if I say Will seems to me sometimes if I perceive her, she seems to exist independently. Right? there's something subtler if I say she seems to exist inherently, or she seems to be will from her own side, or be a person from her own side. Right? So that's a different object to be refuted. Does that mean it's a subtle? That's the subtle one that only the Prasangika scholars refute. Or only they even talk about that as something to be refuted. Is things having, let's just say that's what the term she used, inherent existence or inherent nature. And again, like sometimes that's described as or existing from its own side, which means it has some existence more than being merely labeled by the mind. And so that's another level. I just want to point out that's a more subtle level of dependent origination, right? Labeling. Right? That's more subtle than dependent on causes and conditions. Like, so, for example, because we can see, like, for example, take a sprout, right? You can see that a sprout depends upon causes and conditions, the seed, the sun, the water, and so on, right? It's much more subtle, and that's all true, right? It does depend on those things. But it's more subtle to say it depends upon mere labeling, or mere designation, or mere label, your name. That's what I'm saying, right? So that's a subtler, and Rinpoche talked about that a little bit, right? But pretty brief. He did talk. He used that term a lot, right? Inherent existence. But I think maybe Rinpoche was recognizing that it's hard to that's so hard that he spent maybe more time on the grosser level, of dependent origination than the subtler, and that. No, so he did, because did he talk yesterday about label? A little bit.
I asked him.
You asked, yeah. But he didn't bring that up a lot from some.
No, he was just backing away.
Yeah. But actually, okay, so let's just go back, right? So, because one more thing. So if we say, so if we say unarisen, right? Did not arise and did not cease, right? Sometimes Lama Zopa will use that term, right? Did not arise by nature, right? Or it didn't arise in the sense of having its own nature of arising. Right? One can reasonably label something, right, as arisen. Right? And actually, I'm sort of hesitating because the Rinpoche, we don't want to go beyond what Rinpoche talked about either. That's not the intention. We want to review what Rinpoche said, right? But I will say one more. Okay, so let's just do one more thing, right? Like, let's just take this, right? Okay, so I gave the example earlier, right? So you're sitting there, right? And then you think, I want to see my friend. You look up and you see your friend, right? So that moment of visual, in our analysis right now, that moment of visual perception is a result, right? There were three factors, right? The eye sense power, the visual object, the immediately preceding moment of consciousness, and then there's the resultant moment of visual perception where you say, oh, my friend, right? That's a result. When I say that's a result, for us, doesn't that appear to be a result from its own side now? Or a real result, right? That is the result, right? We all agree. Now but then there's a problem. So that appears to us to be truly the result, right? But then there's another moment of consciousness right after that, right? And wait a second, now that result is actually a cause. It's the immediately preceding moment for the next moment, right? So that moment that's the result, is that the result? Is that a result or is that a cause? If you're looking at it from the perspective of the previous moments giving rise to it, then it appears to you to be a result. Right? If you're looking at it in the next moment when you think, oh, good, my friend is here, right? Now that's a mental, right? Then the immediately preceding moment was that visual consciousness, right? So now that one is a cause, and the mental one is a result. So that moment of visual consciousness, is it a result or is it a cause? Which is it?
Can you say it one more time?
Yeah, like, so maybe I'll use a grosser example for a moment, okay? Let's take the example of, of a tomato seed, right? So just use something grosser, right? So, tomato seeds were planted in my garden, right? And then because of all the different conditions, sunlight, enough sunlight, and a few of them actually ripened, some of them actually ripened. And then some I picked and ate, and some fell to the ground, right? And the ones that fell to the ground, actually some of the plants that grew this year were because ones fell to the ground last year. Does that make sense? They were like, what do you call, volunteer or something? They came up naturally from the ones that fell. So my question is this, let's look at it very simply, right? Right now there's a tomato laying on the ground in my yard, right? So is that tomato a result of last year's tomatoes, or is it a cause of next year's tomato? Which is it, a cause or a result? But it's one tomato, how can it be two things? One seed, right? Let's say one little seed inside that tomato, right? That's going to give rise to a result. If we assume one of those is going to give rise to a tomato plant next year, right? It's one seed. How can it be two things? It can be if it's unitary, if it's one thing, right? Doesn't have to. It's either a result or a cause, isn't it? How can it be both? Then it's two. Then you're saying there are two seeds, even though it's one seed.
Time.
It's more than two. It can also decompose and be a cause for other things.
Yeah, and so which is its nature from its own side? Like, which one? Does it have a nature of being a cause? Does it have a nature of being a result? Does it have a nature of being just tomato-ness? It's not a cause or a result? Does it have a nature of being dirt, because maybe it's going to break down and not grow and become dirt? Like, which is its nature? Is its nature dirt? Is that it? Is it just dirt? It's not a tomato at all?
Can you say that it depends on the conditions? If there are conditions, then it becomes a cause or a result, depending on the conditions.
It depends on its relationship, right?
The relationships.
Yeah. And so part of the implication of that, right, is that it's not any of those things from its own side.
Right.
And conceptually, I can label it. Like I can say, in other words, if I say, this is part of what this is getting at, right? I can say it's the result of last year's tomato, right? And that's okay to say, right? It's a valid verbalization, but is it a result from its own side? No, right? I could say it's a cause of next year's tomato. Is it a cause from its own side? No, it's just my... I could say it's a tomato. Now this is harder. Is it a tomato from its own side?
So you can say it's neither?
What's that?
So you can say it is neither?
Actually, it's in a sense, this is tricky, right? Because, the tricky thing is that this is the difference between conventional truth and ultimate truth, right? Conventionally, there are many things one can say, right? Actually, if you like throwing tomatoes, you can say it's a weapon. There's you can say all different things, and conventionally, there's if you look at a tomato on the ground and you say, is that a weapon? No, right? But if somebody's throwing it, then suddenly you say, yeah, it's a weapon. Hey, hit me in the head with a weapon. And so, is it a weapon from its own side? No, right? Is it a result from its own side? No. It seems like it is to us when we're looking at it from that perspective, right? If it's if you're planting it, then you're not thinking at all as a result, right? If you have a tomato seed and you're going to plant it, actually at that moment you're seeing it as a cause, right? You're hoping that it's going to give rise, right? So then you're saying this is a cause, and that's conventionally it's okay to label it that way, but it's not a cause from its own side, right? If it gives rise to the result, then later you can say, oh, that was the cause, right? But you can say that, but it's not that from its own side. It's only that based on verbal, and conventionally those are all correct. They're They're valid ways of labeling, right? Now, if I say this is if I have a tomato seed and I say this is an elephant, right? That's not conventionally valid, right? That's then you would say that person's crazy, right? That's not a conventionally valid label, right? To say this tomato seed is an elephant. But I can say it's a cause. I can say it's a result. I can call it a tomato. I can call it something else. I don't know what's the word in Tibetan for tomato.
We all say tomato.
Oh, that's funny. I thought you would, because tomatoes are so popular. Tomatoes love cooking with tomatoes. I thought it was
Yeah,
funny.
maybe we don't grow tomatoes.
Oh, that's funny.
But ultimately, it's made up of the five
Yeah,
elements where we are all made up of. And what is the oneness of the everything?
So I'll go back though. So the point really, just to be clear, right, is this: is that none of those, like, right? You could say it's correct, right? You could say, you could also say, if I hold the tomato seed, you could say, if somebody were talking from a philosophical point of view and said, is this made up of the five elements? Yes, right. All objects, like from a Buddhist, in that perspective, you would say, yeah. Somebody else could say, is this made up of atoms? Say yes, right. Somebody else could say, is this made up of molecules? You could say, right. There are so many ways you could correctly label. But the tricky thing is this: check your own experience, right? If I say, is this made up of atoms, right? At that moment, actually, you start, if you're really engaging in the conversation, you start thinking, the feeling is, yes, it's really made up of atoms. There are real atoms there, right? Then if I say, is this a cause? You say, oh yeah, that's really the cause of next year. I hope the tomatoes grow, right? Then you say, is this made up of the five elements? Then you think, oh, the five elements, there's solidity there, right? It's really solid, feels solid. If you're holding your hand, you say, oh, there's solidity here for sure, right? The earth element. Like, and then you reify that and you say, that's real, right? And the point is, but like, what's there to say it? If it were only solidity, for example, right? Then it couldn't, actually tomatoes, they grow, they have quite a bit of moisture in them, right? So it couldn't be, then you would say, well, it can't give rise to something that's moist, right? It feels quite dry when you hold the seed, right? More dry than the tomato does. The point is like, it's not any of those things from its own side, independent of labeling, right? Independent of somebody viewing it as, and it's easier if you see it, like, actually, for us, right? It's easy because tomatoes aren't usually weapons, right? So if you say, well, somebody once threw a tomato at somebody and so it's a weapon, it's easy to say, but a tomato's not a weapon from its own side. That person just did that, right? But just in the same way, it's also not a tomato from its own side. Right? That's a label. It's a concept. It exists only in dependence upon. So there are three levels, right? That sometimes are talked about in dependent origination. One is it's dependent upon causes and conditions, right? Which is what we talked about earlier. Next is it's dependent upon its parts, right? So even a tomato has parts, right? The front and the back, and But again, the front is only the front depending on where I am. Otherwise, the back becomes the front. If I'm standing, if I'm holding a tomato like this, then what I'm calling the front of the tomato is for you the back of the tomato, and so on, right? But it's dependent upon its parts. And then the most subtle one is it's dependent upon designation, upon labeling, upon naming. And which means, right, that that it's not any of those things from its own side, right? Which means from its own side, in that sense, now we can connect it back. It's unarisen. Conventionally, we can say it arose, right? And that's a correct labeling. But from its own side, it doesn't have its own nature, right? As a tomato, and it's conventionally, and so ultimately, it's unarisen, right? So, and that's the differentiation of conventional existence and ultimate. Its ultimate nature is that it's unarisen. It's another. But did you have a comment?
In then verse 43, is the word superimposed, and now we're getting down to this idea, I think, of labeling and the mental consciousness. Is the word superimposed kind of synonymous with labeling? Is it?
Yeah, and one thing, yes. So first of all, you're right, exactly. Conceptualized and superimposed here implies or means, it's labeled, right? And one thing that's really important, let's talk about that verse just a little bit, because again, I think it's useful to point out misunderstandings you can easily develop, and that many, actually you can read books about Buddhism that make this mistake, so it's not an uncommon one. Is where it says here, phenomena that appear in mental conscious chief of them all are conceptualized and then superimposed. When this activity is abandoned, phenomena's lack of self-essence is known, right? Knowing this, meditate on the Dharmadhatu, right? So one is, I mean, this idea of self-essence is exactly what we've been talking about, right? An essence from its own side, having its own nature from its own side, right? That's beyond what's conceptualized and labeled. So exactly. But one thing, if you read this a different way, it'll be easy to misunderstand it, where he says, conceptualize and then superimpose when this activity is abandoned, right? So you can see how some Buddhists, even, like, you know, nerds who were sincere and meant well, but misunderstood, took that to mean, because it said conceptualized and superimposed, and then when this activity is abandoned, they thought, well, so just stop thinking, right? And that's emptiness, right? Stop superimposing stuff. So I just just don't think about anything, right? Empty your mind and don't think anything, and that's emptiness, right? But that's not what, it's quite clear from the tradition of Chandrakirti and so on, that's not what, what Nagarjuna means here is what you were saying, not that, right? So in other words, if one took this to mean, don't conceptualize, don't superimpose, and so like, let's sort of say it, so like so you just meditate in this kind of blank, like I'm going to try to not think about anything and just stop my thoughts, right? Actually, then what happens really is that the person then there's a subtle level of still self-grasping, right? And the person's thinking, I'm stopping my thoughts. Right? And they're still holding on to, they're not refuting that sense of an I that's stopping my thoughts, and the person then they think, oh, I'm quite good. I've done a good job stopping my thoughts. That's not what Nagarjuna means, and you didn't imply it is. I'm just trying to point out a misunderstanding people get sometimes here. But what... it seems quite clear what Nagarjuna is getting at there is what we're is what you were talking about, right? So it's that it's actually that so that there's this sense of and what's tricky, right, is that like in terms of the process, right? It's that things appear to us to have their own self-essence, right? Because of our beginningless familiarity with ignorance. Without even trying to, we superimpose this sense of a self-essence or inherent nature on things. And that Khenpo Rinpoche said this. He said even people who have seen emptiness directly, actually, even Arya Bodhisattvas, still perceive things as if they have inherent nature. So even after they've seen emptiness directly, they still their eye consciousness still perceive. That's actually who Nagarjuna is really talking about here, right? Khenpo Rinpoche said that. He said, after some, so Khenpo Rinpoche said this, let's get into that. Right, so when a bodhisattva has realized, you go through those paths, right? They've finished the path of accumulation, they finished the path of preparation, and they reach the path of seeing, where they see emptiness directly, right? At that point, which is the path, that happens on the path of seeing, and then they become an Arya Bodhisattva, right? So then that person, when they're in meditative equipoise, Rinpoche talked about that, right? So when that person is in meditative equipoise, it's like there's just the bare perception of emptiness, and in past times, she said it's like water poured into water. There's no sense experience. I mean, there's a direct perception of emptiness, and so there's no experience of a seer or a scene or an act of seeing. There's just a kind of direct, experience of emptiness. Right? But then when that person arises from that experience, right? Out of meditative equipoise, and they start to interact again with the world, they're not yet a Buddha, and so they still, when they see something, it appears to them as if has its own nature. That's their visual perception is like that. Or even when they have a thought, it can initially seem to them as if that thought is real, right? Has its own nature, but they know that it doesn't have. In other words, they know from their own experience, so they don't believe that. They don't believe those appearances, right? So for them, it's an illusion-like. They see it as illusion-like. They don't. In other words, like so there is a when they see their friend, there's still some kind of out of old habituation, some perception as if the friend appears as if it's truly existing, but they don't believe that anymore, so they don't buy into it, so they don't develop what's the word? So they don't kill somebody based on their friend. They don't do those kind of karmas anymore because they don't believe that kind of perception anymore. They know it to be like a dream, like an illusion, and that's for them. Things actually appear they actually have the experience, rather, of knowing that things are dreamlike or are illusion-like. We can cultivate that and sort of, but for us it's an effortful kind of cultivation. For them it's a natural way of relating to their perceptions. And so that's different. But so the point is that when this phenomena's lack of self-essence is known, so the point I was getting at anyway is this, is that, so things appear to have the self-essence, right? And then we believe in that. We actually believe that, right? So there's not only do things appear to have a self-essence or inherent nature, but we actually buy into or believe in that a false appearance. Right? And so that's all, what's the word, conceptualized and superimposed upon the object, right? And so what he's saying here clearly, right, are conceptualized and superimposed when this activity is abandoned. So it doesn't mean don't have any thoughts. What it means is recognize, right, Rinpoche kept saying yesterday, the wisdom that can differentiate existence from true existence, right? So in that sense, that's what this is getting at, right? That one understands how one is superimposing true existence onto things, and then by abandoning that superimposition, right, of true existence onto things, you realize, you know their lack of self-essence, right? That's how you actually come to know the lack of self-essence of an object, right? Is that you see how you're imposing true existence, right, or inherent existence onto the object. When you can differentiate existence from true existence, you see there's the mere appearance, right? But things actually lack this superimposed inherent nature or self-essence, right? And then when you know that, you can meditate on Dharmadhatu, because the Dharmadhatu is the emptiness of that, right? But if you can't differentiate that, then you can't meditate on Dharmadhatu, right? It's only when you can differentiate existence from true existence, you can see your superimposition, then you realize the object is empty of that superimposition, whether it's my own mind, or my thoughts, or my other perceptions, right? So when you can have that differentiation, then you can meditate on the Dharmadhatu.
And by Dharmadhatu here, does he specifically mean the emptiness of mind?
Well, in this one he's saying mental consciousness, so it does make sense, right? In this one it would be that. One thing I thought that it was interesting that Ken Rinpoche pointed out was that, actually in a sense all of these are Dharmadhatu in that way. I hadn't gotten that until Rinpoche said it. I hadn't really understood that correctly, I don't think, or so precisely, that Rinpoche was really saying, since all of these 6 are actually consciousness, right? Even if it's visual consciousness, ear consciousness, that actually it's proving and really it's proving the emptiness of each of the 6 kinds of consciousnesses, and the last one being the mental consciousness. So in that sense, they're all Dharmadhatu, but this one would be the mental consciousness, it's emptiness, it's being Dharmadhatu, which is which is like the most, which is the Buddha nature. Yeah, that's it. Which is our Buddha nature. The emptiness of the mental consciousness is what's understood to be our sort of natural Buddha nature. That's sort of that's different than the developing Buddha nature, right? Because Rinpoche differentiated those two, right? So that's our natural Buddha nature, is the emptiness of the mind, of the mental consciousness itself. And then remember that. And then the developing Buddha nature is the mind's clarity. It's clear knowing nature. It's developed, because that's what can develop into. Because Rinpoche said that, right? The natural Buddha nature, right, is what is the emptiness, the ultimate nature, right, which has always been there, right? Always, as long as mind is beginningless, and the nature of mind, therefore, has always been empty, an emptiness, right? And that's your natural Buddha nature. And when the mind becomes, when the mind is purified of all of its, as Rinpoche talked about yesterday, when the mind is eventually purified of all of its afflictive emotions or afflictions or delusions and their imprints, right, then one becomes the Buddha, right? But that the Buddha's mind, it's still the same continuum, right? And then that, the emptiness of that mind is called the nature body, or the Spavavika-kaya, right, of the Buddha. So that's that, and then the developing Buddha nature, the mind's clarity, right, is what allows for all the different the merit, right, the positive compassion, bodhicitta, patience and generosity, right? To give rise to all the other, like the other bodies of the Buddha. Right? So other than the Svabhavakaya, the others arise from that developing Buddha nature. But they're both the mind, right? The one is the conventional nature of mind, which is its clarity, and the other is its the ultimate nature, its emptiness. So the two natures of the mind are the two, are what we call the two Buddha natures, the two kinds of Buddha nature.
The sound. I had a problem with sound. So he said like something like what kind, like that kind of knowledge. What kind of knowledge? He said something like that kind of knowledge.
Which verse is it? Like the
Number 39.
sound and ear assume they're right. Okay, so
The yogis detect with the, like they detect that there is like, you know, the something like he said like, yeah, I had a question about it. He said like the yogi they detect with the sound that kind of knowledge mixed with conceptual thought. Something like that.
that Rinpoche, you mean this is like a phrase Rinpoche said?
Yeah, like I should say like yeah.
Okay, so say it again. Just so
He said like the yogi they detect when they detect with the sound that kind of knowledge mixed with conceptual thoughts. That when they meditate equipoise. No, when they hear sounds, they detect with that kind of knowledge. I don't know what kind of knowledge he was talking about.
I'm not sure exactly, but I guess it would be this. One thing that it is important to differentiate is that because Rinpoche was talking at this point, right, also about the yogis, right? You said like, so it was this concept of the yogi. So one thing that's important is that when the yogi is in meditative equipoise, right, directly realizing emptiness, there are no conceptual thoughts at that time, right? In other words, they're in a direct perception. So for them at that time, there is because up until then, actually even emptiness, for us, actually our perception, our understanding of emptiness is conceptual, right? Until you're at that level, you can't see emptiness directly until you reach the path of seeing, right? So for us, our understanding of emptiness is conceptual. But then for that person, right, once they realize emptiness directly, their experience of emptiness is non-conceptual. It's direct. So they don't have. It's a non-conceptual experience. But then when they come out of that, right, like I said, they're not a Buddha yet. So when they come out of that direct perception, then for example, their experience of hearing in this example, right, like. Still, as I said earlier, right, so I just said, like, still, when they hear something, there's an appearance to them of true existence. And I think, now I know, this is what Rinpoche was saying. So, yeah, okay, now I remember what Rinpoche said. So Rinpoche was saying, so in the direct perception, there is no concept, right? So remember that, there's no conceptual thoughts, right? But then when even that yogi, right, who's like an Arya Bodhisattva now on one of the bhumis, right? They're like, great being. But even for them, when they hear something, there's the appearance of true existence. Mm-hmm. And so he said, at that time, their meditation on emptiness is conceptual. In other words, that they realize, they understand, conceptually, that's empty. That's empty. It appears to me as if it has its own self-nature, but it's actually empty of that. So at that time, they can't directly perceive emptiness when they're walking around and listening, but conceptually, they're remembering, or they're bringing to mind, or they're conceptually understanding that visual sound is empty of inherent nature. What I see is empty of inherent nature. What I smell is empty of inherent nature. What I taste is, all that is conceptual for them, until they go back into meditative equipoise. Then again, they have a non-conceptual. But then they arise again, and that's the whole process of the bodhisattvas. They go back and forth between going around and practicing the other perfections, right, and then practicing the direct meditative equipoise on the perfection of wisdom, on understanding emptiness. So when they're practicing the other perfections, they're conceptually remembering and thinking of emptiness and understanding, and they're actually realizing emptiness conceptually as they're hearing or smelling and so on. But then they have the non-conceptual experience only in meditative equipoise. So that's what Rinpoche was saying, is that they're actually continuing to cultivate their understanding of emptiness, but it's conceptual at that time.
Because it's kind of funny because I mean, that's how I think, because there's no object. When you hear something, there's no object. Because, I mean, when I smell something, I can say like a bottle of perfume, and then, or like when I eat something, I can see an object, or like when, you know, I can see, but hearing, I can't see anything. It's like kind of, so I mean, it's kind of cool, you know, yeah.
So is it easier? Sometimes maybe it's easier then, right, with hearing to understand emptiness, you know,
I think it's hard for me. I mean,
or harder. you're saying.
because yeah, I think it's hard because there's no object. I mean, you know, because I can look at an object, be like, yeah, but like, I don't know, it's hard.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the bell, you know, when you have the vajra and the bell,
Mhm.
and these two come, these symbols come together,
Yeah,
and you hear it, and then you can sort of let it go and see what happens.
yeah.
That for me, that's always the trick,
okay.
those implements that
So
are
you think about
used.
Vajra and there. Yeah.
Vajra, that
Yeah, there are many verses about sound, right, where they talk about like, is the sound like, you know, if you're analyzing for ultimate status, you say, and when you hear sound, it seems like it's truly existent, right? But then actually they do an analysis like that where they say, like, if you were like what's there say, if it's a bell, right, does it exist on the thing that's hanging, or does it exist on the outer? You know, which one is the sound there, or is the sound in the ear? Is it in the? That's one way of meditating on this, right? So, like, let's say somebody rings a bell, right? So then you say, where does the sound exist? Does it exist on the ear sense power, like the eardrum or something? Does it exist on the clangor? Does it exist on the body of the bell? Does it exist on the air in between? Or does it exist, what's we say, on the consciousness? And you would say, well, you know, you could analyze that, right? You could say, well, definitely if there's just the clangor, that's not sound, right? Actually, even and also you need air, right? We know that scientifically, right? Even if you bang something in outer space where there's nothing, it doesn't, right? You need, in other words, you need all these different factors, right? And so you can actually analyze like that. So where does the sound exist? Does it, you know, there is a sound that appears, right? It appears, right? And you say, oh, that's sound, right? But then if you start to analyze for its ultimate status as findability, to find it, right? So you have this sense of real sound, right? But then you analyze, does it exist on the ear sense power? Does it exist on the clangor? Does it exist on the body of the bell? Does it exist on the consciousness? Then you see there's no truly existent sound, right, that can be found, and yet still it appears. Right? So that's you know, conventionally there's the appearance, and then you label sound, but ultimately that not being able to find a truly existent sound implies it's empty, having being sound from its own side, right? So actually there is no sound from its own side, right? It's merely labeled sound, dependent upon many factors.
There's also the, from the science perspective, also just that sound and light are always, as you perceive them, they're actually happening in the past. So by the time the sound, you know, comes to your ear, you think it's real time, but it happened, you know, a while ago. Happened before. And the same with light too, just much faster. Well, it's the same speed actually. Yeah. Depending on the waves.
Yeah, the other well, so okay. So about the mostly we focus on this one point, right? About the you know, dependent origination of perception, right? Implying the emptiness of perception, or that it's unarisen. And actually, let's just say I would say one more thing, right? That example we just gave of sound, right? Like, so sound appears, right? And then if you analyze it, right? Does it exist on the clangor? Does it exist on the, you know, you do that. Does it exist on the, right? Then you would say, actually, like, there was conventionally, right? It's conventionally in terms of language, right? It's appropriate to say, I heard the bell. Right? Somebody rings a bell, you say, I heard the bell, right? And you're not crazy, right? That's a valid label. Right? But then when you analyze, right? So in that sense, conventionally, you could say a sound arose. A person rang the bell and the sound arose, right? Then you analyze. You say, does it exist on the clangor? Does it exist on the you know, if it truly arose, if it's real, right, if it has its own nature, then it should be findable. Right? So then you check. It has to be something. If it has its own nature, if it has inherent existence, if it has real existence, then it should be findable. Right? So you analyze, this is on the ear sense power, this and that, right? And finally you realize it's not, it's unfindable. Right? That true sound, the truly existent sound is not findable, right? Therefore no truly existent sound arose. Right? Therefore no truly existent sound stopped. Right? That which didn't arise can't stop. Well, that's what Nagarjuna is saying, right? So there's the mere conventional appearance that's merely labeled, right, of sound, but ultimately no sound is findable, no sound arose, no sound stopped, right? No sound abided, no sound existed from its own side at any point. It never did. It's not that you're refuting something that truly existed. It never did exist in that way. It was superimposed. That idea of a real sound existing from its own side was superimposed, right? That's what we were saying here. And that's different than labeled, right? Whereas like, the merely labeled is a valid conventional thing. The superimposition is believing it exists from its own side. So those are different also. Does that make sense? Sometimes people also make that mistake thinking that like the problem is labeling. That's not the problem. The problem is believing that things exist truly or from their own side. Labeling is just conventional, pass the salt or whatever, can I please have some water or something. That's just conventional discourse. That's not the problem. The problem is believing that the other person truly exists, that I truly exist, that's inherently exists. That's the problem. Does that make sense? It's not, so the problem isn't conventional labels. The problem is believing that things have their own, what do you call it, self-essence. Right? That's the way it's translated.
That's a good one.
Again, because that's a mistake people make. Sometimes people think, so just stop labeling. And but again, that's like, first of all, that doesn't work, right? And also, that's not the fundamental problem. The problem isn't using words. The problem is, because sometimes people talk about that, right? But actually, like again, some ancient Buddhists did this, and also modern Buddhists misunderstand that sometimes. They say, like kind of words are the problem. But actually, that's not what Nagarjuna is saying, and that's not what the tradition is saying. The tradition is saying, conventionally, words can be a valid description on a conventional level, but ultimately, things don't have their own self. I thought maybe next we would talk a little bit about this idea of the like leading up to the 10 strengths or 10 powers that Rinpoche taught about. To talk a little bit about like this whole idea of the 4 bodies of a Buddha, and also this, or 3 or 4. There were different ways to determine. Actually, you can divide them into 2, 3, 4, just depending on how you want to discuss it. And then also this idea of like of seeing the quality, right? Like there was a lot that Rinpoche was talking about already about how, like from Nagarjuna's text about being able to receive the blessing power of the Buddhas, or being able to perceive the Buddhas, right? And that depends on you asked questions about that, right? That depends on how much purification you've done, or how much merit you have, or how, right? And so like Rinpoche was saying, like beings in the lower realms, then it's almost like, and right, like, I mean, that we know that, right? Like that, there are all those stories, we've talked about those before, like about like, there are many different stories of like from India, the Mahasiddhas who had like trouble, right? Like where, but even like a Sangha, right? Like when he did the 12 years of retreat, right? And then like, he was trying to see Maitreya, right? And then for 12 years he couldn't see Maitreya, right? And then he saw like a dog, right, that was infested with maggots, right? And remember, like after he generated so much love for the dog, right? But then he also had love for the maggots, and then he like cut part of his own flesh to put the maggots in, and then he would to, like lift them with his tongue, right? Because he didn't want to hurt the maggots, so he thought if I pick them with my finger, I'll kill them. So he went, and then like he kept going with his tongue, and then finally his face hit the dirt, right? And then he looked down, and the dog wasn't there, and then Maitreya was there, right? And then Maitreya said like, after 12 years, you only had enough purification so you could see a dog, you know. And he said, then through your love, you purified enough that now you can see Maitreya, right? But then Asanga said, well, why weren't you there for all the 12 years? Like, you didn't believe Maitreya, right? And then Maitreya said, I was there the whole time, you just didn't see me. So that was exactly what Rinpoche was talking about, right? That as soon as you evoke the Buddhas, they're there, but it's a matter of your own purification of your mind, if you have the karma that allows you to see them, right? And so, I don't say one person, but like, right, so then you can see also like how, like Lama Zopa often emphasizes this point where he says like, how you perceive the world depends on how pure how much you've purified and how much karma, right? And so like ordinary people just see, right? Like you read stories like that, right? Where some people go see His Holiness the Dalai Lama and they see a person, right? Then like, but there are many stories, right? Of like, in past times of previous Dalai Lamas and also the current, right? Where some people, they look and they see 1,000 armed Genrezi there, right? And that's their actual perception, because they have that karma, right? Like their karma is to see that, and then we have so much, just like, so we should rejoice we have so much good karma we can see a person, right? Because then, actually, if you think about it, right, if some Chinese official, then when they see, they just see like, what, a demon, something, right? Isn't that what they say?
That's what they say.
Right. In their mind, they have like some negative label.
Like that.
Yeah, I know, it's funny, right? So it depends on your karma, right? That's like that story though, like Lekbe karma, right? That Rinpoche was telling, right? Like where they don't see any, like, even with the Buddha, they don't see any good qualities, right? Like some people, right? And Devadatta, right? He didn't see any good qualities in the Buddha. So it depends on your karma is the point, right? So Rinpoche was explaining. But sometimes I was thinking, right? Like then, of course, there are many stories like that, right? Of like yogis who could hear, like Rinpoche said, who can hear a statue, and it talks to them. So then also we have to, what's the word to say it? Like, so I always think that it's good to know, like, so we shouldn't judge other people too much, right? Because we don't know. Right? Somebody actually like that might look crazy. Right? They're talking to a statue. Actually, they know how to. Of course, most yogis like that don't. They keep that private. But the point is that we can't judge somebody else's level of perception. Right? Anyway, let's talk about those. So, in order to get to the 10 qualities, also Rinpoche covered this. Let's talk about the 4 bodies, right? The 4 kayas. So, also, the term kaya means body, right? Just Sanskrit word means body. And Rinpoche said that, right? That like body in that sense, like Rinpoche said that, right? It doesn't mean like, because we'll see this when we get to the nature body and the dharma body, right? The svabhavika kaya and the dharma kaya. That it's not a body in the sense of a flesh and blood phenomenon, but it's like a, what did Rinpoche say? Like a collection is the word he used. I guess. Although I hesitated because the nature body is not exactly a collection either, in a way. But it's also called a body. But so let's go through the 4 bodies of a Buddha briefly, since Rinpoche talked about it. So, like, one is in Sanskrit the svabhavika kaya, which you could translate as the nature body. That's the one, right, that in one sense, like, that's the, speaking of the praise of Dharmadhatu, right, so that's like, how do I say it, like, sometimes it's said that that's the one, like, you could say that, what I was saying earlier, the emptiness of the person's mind, right, like, in other words, the ultimate nature of our mind now is emptiness, right, which is Dharmadhatu. And so as long as we're a sentient being, right, that's like our Buddha potential. But then at the time when you become a Buddha, then it's the emptiness of that mind, right, of the mind that has, and that's part of the definition of the Svabhavika is, it's the emptiness of a mind that has completely abandoned the 2 extremes, the extreme of non-existence, the extreme of reifying some kind of true existence. So then the emptiness of that mind, you could say, is the nature body of the Buddha, right? So in a sense, it's the same continuum. Like that's why you could say it's like we have because our mind is empty of inherent nature, inherent existence, then when we've purified all of our afflictive emotions and our obstacles to knowledge, then the emptiness of that mind will be the nature body of the Buddha. And one thing it says in the commentary, I remember you talked about, so I just wanted to clarify, is it says here that mind is free of the three obscurations. And remember she talked about this, the obscurations of the afflictions, right? Remember she taught that. Then the obscurations that are obstacles to knowledge, right? Which means like the obstacles to the Buddha's omniscience. Right? And those usually the first one is the afflictions, right? Which even arhats have eliminated, right? Even a Hinayana, or someone who's achieved individual liberation, they've gotten rid of the first of these three, all the afflictions. But they haven't gotten rid of the second one, which is the obstacles to knowledge.
Yeah.
Right? And that's the imprints of the afflictions. So that's not, there is, you could say like that, so the person who's achieved individual liberation got rid of their own they've got rid of all the afflictions, like hatred, desire, pride, and so on. But the imprints of those that are obstacles to knowing all phenomena, they didn't get rid of that yet. So then a Buddha has also gotten rid of the second of these, which are the what's it called? Obscurations that are obstacles to knowing, in order to achieve the omniscient mind of the Buddha. And then the third one that Tashi explained in translation yesterday was obscurations to meditative absorptions. And actually this text describes it this way. It says, the obscurations of meditative absorptions is an obscuration where one is seeking the bliss of peace for oneself alone, or where you still have some kind of it could be an attachment to one of those different realms, or something like that, of the bliss of meditation, and that's an obstacle to compassion for others, right? There is, if you have some kind of attachment to any kind of meditative state, then that's an obstacle to being of compassion, to the Mahayana path. So I won't go into more detail, but then I wanted to, so that's the nature body. Then the next one is the, what's it called, Sambhogakaya, right, or the complete enjoyment body. That's sometimes translated like that. And what I want to explain is, so Rinpoche talked about this one quite a bit yesterday, right? I'm going to call it the enjoyment body. Is that a simple way to say it? The enjoyment body of the Buddha. And some people, I think, had questions. So this is important. So based on the Buddha's mind, right? The Buddha manifests form. So one form that a Buddha manifests, that's an actual form, is this enjoyment body. So usually, that's why I thought to go through this. Usually the enjoyment body is said to have 5 qualities. So if you understand these 5 qualities, it helps to understand what is the enjoyment body. So one of the first of the 5 qualities is, they're each like definite. They call it definite. Each one begins with the word definite. So the first is a definite abode, which means that the enjoyment body always abides, right, or always exists in a certain realm, which is a pure realm. And this one says the highest pure realm. So they don't abide. They're not perceived in places other than a pure realm, or the highest pure realm. So they're not. That's different than an emanation body, which can exist on like the ordinary earth, to be perceived by ordinary beings. So that's the first quality of the enjoyment body, is it has a definite abode of abiding only in the. Here it says the heavily adorned highest pure land. But they exist in a particular kind of pure land, the highest level of pure land. The second quality of this enjoyment body is definite retinue, which means who's around them. Like retinue, like we all have you could say a person has a retinue, like your family or your friends or who you work with, your coworkers. That could be our retinue, right? The retinue of the complete enjoyment body is only Arya Bodhisattvas. So it's only bodhisattvas who have already seen emptiness directly. That only they are capable of perceiving the enjoyment body of the Buddha. Ordinary beings just can't perceive it. They don't have the karma to be able to see this kind of body. And even arhats and pratyeka Buddhas can't perceive this kind of body. Only Arya Bodhisattvas are capable of perceiving the enjoyment body of the Buddha.
So I can see like, let's say I can see like a guru, I can be seeing ordinary, other person can be seeing it as Sambhoga.
They can see something else, yeah. Also, if they're an
Or
Arya
one
Bodhisattva.
person, like Rinpoche, maybe I can see ordinary, somebody else can see like.
Yeah, it's possible. But then that person would also be abiding in the, right, that, so that person,
State of mind.
if they're seeing that, they're abiding in the Pure Land.
So they're not state of mind.
This is not the mind though, this is the body. Of the person.
Or their bodies like that too.
Yeah, they see, I mean, they see the body. If it's a Sambhogakaya, it means it's a bodily form. But that person has to be an Arya Bodhisattva to perceive that.
So what about Arya Bodhisattva? Are they in the same form too?
Oh, not necessarily, no, because they're not a Buddha, right?
Yeah.
Because they're not a Buddha. So only a Buddha has a Sambhogakaya form.
And now that we are here, Rinpoche said once the illusory body is only a means to get to one of those pure lands.
No, that's different.
But that still keeps on coming on in my mind.
What do you mean, the illusory body in Tantra?
Yeah, that you need that. Why you need that body is, and I thought it was for different reasons, but he said you only need it to go to a pure land, to receive teachings.
Illusory body only. You can do that with the illusory body. That's correct.
You can do that.
Yeah, that's correct. You can do that with the illusory body. But it also, actually, but if somebody achieves the illusory body in the tantric context, that means they're going to achieve Buddhahood in that same life. So it's more meaning than just going to a pure land, because that person's going to achieve Buddhahood in that same lifetime. Right? That's one of the definitions of the, like one of the defining characteristics or one of the defining benefits of the illusory body, and that's in the Guhya Samaja of Tantra. So if somebody achieves that level, then they're going to achieve Buddhahood in the same life. So it's like Milarepa or.
See, I didn't know.
So that's somebody who's very high, like they're going to become a Buddha before they die.
Right.
So that's why it's more than just like it's a very high realization.
Well, that's very nice to know because I
Yeah.
was always.
Yeah, somebody who achieves that is, Yentrim Shade many times said that definitely that person is definite to achieve enlightenment, and that they won't have another death and rebirth. They're going to become a Buddha, actually, not even a Bodhi. That's not just, they're going to achieve actual Buddhahood in that. So that's according to the Guhya Samaja Tantra, that says that that realization of the illusory body, that's supposed to be, so that person will achieve Buddhahood in that same lifetime. Yentrim Shade said that definitely. You know, a number of things. So that's a very high realization.
And then they might go to a pure land too.
They can go wherever they want then, right? Yeah, they can
Oh, that is right.
so they can go every
Okay.
place. Yeah.
Okay.
They can go to benefit others. They can go to pure. They can go any place.
Yeah, because they're Buddha.
Exactly.
I mean, I've never put those two
Yeah.
together.
Yeah, so that person can go anywhere.
Okay.
Okay, so go back. So that person, so it's the definite abode, which is the highest pure land, definite retinue, which is Arya Bodhisattvas, right? Third one is definite doctrine. And what that says is the enjoyment body teaches only the Mahayana teachings. You know, so like the emanate, because, which makes sense, right? Emanation bodies come to benefit all kinds of beings, right? So they have to teach all different kinds of things. This enjoyment body is only teaching Bodhisattva, Arya Bodhisattva, so they only teach the Mahayana, because they don't have to suit the level of teaching to all different kinds of beings, because only Arya Bodhisattvas see them, so they only teach the Mahayana. Then definite body, and what that means is that they always have a body that's adorned with the 32 major marks of a Buddha and the 80 minor marks of a perfect being. So they have the, you know, those are like all these like kind of physical characteristics of a fully enlightened being. So they have that kind of body that has like a Vishnisha, you know, the Buddhas, and they have the, we can go through them all, they're in the book actually, but those are described in the text by Maitreya. So like they have, you know, they have natural, like they, instead of like we have these kind of lines on our hand, theirs are in the shape of a wheel, you know, and so on. They have many different, so they have 32 major and 80 minor physical signs, and that body always has those qualities. And the fifth one is definite time. And that one is that the enjoyment body abides without showing the aspect of birth and death until the end of cyclic existence. In other words, until all samsara is empty of all sentient beings, that body will abide in that pure land.
What's the fifth one?
So the fifth one is definite time. Yeah, so definite abode, retinue, doctrine, body, and time. So definite times means that body isn't born and it's not subject to birth and death like an ordinary person. It's in this Pure Land and it sort of sends out emanations, but it stays there, teaching until the end of samsara.
Oh, okay.
So what is Amitabha? What Amitabha?
Oh, we'll get to that. This is not Amitabha.
I don't know.
Amitabha is different. That's not he's not a
Sambhogakaya.
he's not a Sambhogakaya. We'll get to that in a minute. A Sambhogakaya, actually, I don't know this. Usually, and many times, Sambhogakaya Buddhas are pictured like with, you can see some of the pictures like, where they're usually in, at least in Tibetan iconography, they're pictured with like crown. They have the Ushisha, but they're also pictured with like the ornaments. They're pictured like a divine. In most art, they're pictured as these kind of divine beings because they're living in a Pure Land, like a divine realm. And so ordinarily, the images of them are like that. Like, so they have all the marks and signs of a Buddha, and also they're adorned with like silken clothes, and when you look at the pictures of them. And then let's talk about, so that's the Sambhogakaya, right? The enjoyment body of a Buddha. And remember, that can only be perceived by Arya Bodhisattvas, right? So then in order to benefit ordinary non-Arya Bodhisattvas, right, the Buddha has to send out emanation bodies, right? And that's what Rinpoche was talking about yesterday, right? So that, and like that, in a sense, like effortlessly, they send out emanations whenever there's somebody to be benefited, right, who can benefit from that. And Rinpoche mentioned some texts mention 4 kinds of emanation bodies. So this will answer your question about Amitabha. I'll go through them in the order they are here. So one is that we talked about yesterday was, I'll go through all 4 just because even though Rinpoche mentioned 3, I'll say which one he didn't mention. So one is artisan emanation bodies. Artisan, that was when I said like artist or artisan.
What is that?
And so what that is where the Buddha doesn't, the person is not, it's not suitable or they're not ready to be benefited by like a Buddha form. So the Buddha manifests as an artist, essentially, as a musician, as a painter, as a sculptor, or even like as an architect who's building holy places, or something that'll inspire beings to benefit. And they give an example here from the Buddha's previous life, or no, from the previous lives, but after the Buddha was enlightened. But it says, for example, the Buddha once manifested in the form of a great flute player, in order to subdue the king of the Gandharvas, like he was a celestial musician. So like he manifested as a better musician than the best musician in order to kind of subdue the pride and arrogance of that being. But in this idea, right? So like there might be like Buddhas who manifest to write who are songwriters, for example, right? And write inspiring songs that cause beings to be inspired towards virtue, or the Buddha, there could be great artists or all different kinds of creative people, but they're not normal people. They're emanations of a Buddha.
Right.
Yeah, a great actor might be that. Any kind of
Because there's a lot going on in that field right now.
yeah. So we don't know who's a Buddha, right? Like so, that many of them could be
Wow.
anybody. Because we don't know that. But that's where so the Buddha manifests as some kind of artisan or artist. It could be an artist, like an actor, or a painter, or it could be also an artisan, like somebody who, again, somebody who's building bridges so people can get across, or building, like doing the activity like that to benefit. Like let's say if the Buddha sees there's somebody who would benefit from being able to go to Dharma classes, but there's no bridge to cross the river, then the Buddha might manifest as a bridge, build a bridge, or something like that. So that's so craftsmen or artists. That's one type of thing.
How can you think about scientists then? How they...
It doesn't mention that. Maybe there's no scientists. I don't know. I'm joking.
The Dalai Lama is so much into that, and I have a son who is into that, and he just, because that really gets his passion.
Yeah, that might be. Well, let's see. Actually, that might be the next one. That would probably be the next one. Actually.
Oh,
Yeah, because
so
this one
that's
is
not artisan.
No, that's not
more-
artisan. This is specific. That one was specifically artisans.
Right.
So artists or creative,
Right.
like The second one is called what Rinpoche. Now Rinpoche mentioned this one also. This is the second one that Rinpoche did mention, which is they call it birth emanation body, where the Buddha takes birth in various forms in order to benefit beings. So that could be a scientist. Rinpoche said that could be a human being. It could be an animal. among the hungry ghosts, it could be as a hungry ghost. Among the gods, it could be as a god. But it's the Buddha manifesting as a person, right, to benefit those kind of beings. And there are stories even of there are some stories of in some of the Mahasiddha stories, right? There are stories where like somebody was there are even stories where like somebody came across like even like a prostitute who then inspired, like who wasn't really a person, actually was a Buddha, who then that person was having a lot of desire, and that then Buddha manifested in that way, and then led them in the different direction, away from the wrong direction towards the right direction. So it could be any kind of, that could be a scientist, it could be it could be anybody though, right? And they say sometimes that's like that, right? Where a person, there could be a whole lifetime that the Buddha manifests a particular kind of person, just so that at this day this person's going to come there, and they're going to explain something that turns that person's whole life around. So that would be like a birth image. So a scientist could be that would be categorized in this way.
Right.
But it could be anybody. Right? It could be a parent. It could be a teacher. It could be but not like, I don't mean like, it could be any kind of being who. But the Buddha manifests that emanation to benefit specific people. Right? But they don't have the form of a Buddha. They have the appearance of being an ordinary person, but they are actually an emanation of the Buddha who's there to benefit them. So that's clear in here. That's the second kind. Then Rinpoche mentioned the supreme emanation body, right? But this text, which is from the Uttara Tantra, mentions a fourth one, so I'll just mention it. Okay, like they differentiate supreme emanation body from what they're calling great enlightenment emanation body, and so that's what they categorize as Amitabha. So they would talk about this body has the form looking like a Buddha, but doesn't do the 12 deeds that a supreme emanation body does. So like a Buddha, like this is like in pure, this would like the great what's it called here? Enlightenment emanation body, like Amitabha's form. He doesn't have the quality. He doesn't do the 12 deeds of a Buddha like Shakyamuni did. So that wouldn't be a supreme emanation body, but it would be a great enlightenment emanation body. And so that's like, oftentimes these could be like medicine Buddha, for example, could be like that, right? In the medicine Buddha's Pure Land, there are these each of the medicine Buddhas are in their different Pure Lands. Amitabha's in his Pure Land. There are many different Buddhas in their Pure Lands who are said to be, that would be the category of great enlightenment emanation bodies.
They are without the what?
12 deeds of a Buddha. And I'll go through those actually. So the quality of a supreme emanation body, and Khenpo yesterday said that's Shakyamuni Buddha, right? Is a supreme emanation body. And when Maitreya comes to this earth, he'll be a supreme emanation body, right? And all the 1,000 Buddhas of this eon will have supreme emanation bodies. So that means they take rebirth on a particular planet, and they do 12 deeds. So one is they descend from a Pure Land. They take rebirth in a womb of a mother. So that's why Amitabha is not, you can see Amitabha is not this, because in his Pure Land beings are born from lotuses, right? So he doesn't have to be born, he's not born from somebody's womb. Actually, there's no gender in his Pure Land, so he can't be born from a womb. There's no male or female in Amitabha's Pure Land. So the 12 actions of a supreme emanation body are descend from a Pure Land, entering the mother's womb, taking birth, becoming skilled in various arts, delighting in the company of royal consorts, then developing renunciation and becoming ordained as a monk or a nun, for example, then practicing austerities for 6 years, then proceeding to the foot of the Bodhi tree, or a tree of enlightenment and achieving enlightenment there. Proceeding to the foot first. Then the 9th one is overcoming the host of demons, of Mara. Then the 10th is becoming fully enlightened. The 11th is turning the wheel of the doctrine, or the Dharma. And the 12th is passing away. So those are the 12. And so, so you can see it's totally different than those other, right? Whereas this body also dies. It's designed that way. The supreme emanation body goes to a planet and goes through this process, and helps the planet in a way, helps the beings on that planet to establishes like a whole doctrine on that planet that lasts for a certain length of time. And you read in the sutras, it says, like they even predict, right? The Buddha predicted his doctrine will last for a certain amount of time. then will disappear, then Maitreya will come, his doctrine will last for a certain amount of time, then will disappear, then the next, and so on, and keep going. So those are supreme emanation bodies that kind of come and do these 12 actions.
So, it's kind of funny. So does that mean like each time a Buddha comes, the world looks the same?
No, it doesn't have to look the same.
I mean, because they do the same thing. That means it looks the same. It's
Oh, but they don't, like, it doesn't mean that, what's there to say it, like,
gonna be green and houses are gonna be like this.
oh no, because it could be on different, like, there are supreme emanation bodies on other planets that can do this, so it could look different. In a
Each
different
eon, a Buddha comes and then they have to go through all this stuff.
Yeah, so the idea, I guess, of this is like, I guess one thing is like, in a way, this set of 12 deeds, right, is like, what's there to say it? Like, or is there a slight, they can vary though some, like, it said that, for example, that, like, while the Buddha took birth in, Lumbini, right, and then died in Kushnagar, it said that Maitreya will take birth in Kushnagar and die in Lumbini, so it'll be the same in India, and they'll both sit under the Bodhi tree. But what's to say it, like, I think it said, like, for example, the Buddha was was reborn in the caste of the warrior, right, the king. What's that?
Shaka.
The Shakya clan, right? But it said that Maitreya will be born because at the time of Maitreya, what's now called Brahmins, it may have a different name then, but like the spiritual sort of caste or group will have more ascendance, so he'll be reborn in that family. The point is that they're born into it. They're born, like, I think part of the point here is that they're. This is my own interpretation now, so I'm just making this part up. So I could be wrong, but I think part of it might be that they're born, like, whereas these deeds, if you look at them, right, like being, having delighting in the company of consorts, and then renouncing, is they're trying to. I mean, their life itself is a teaching. That's part of the point, right? So it's a certain life pattern that teaches about renunciation, right? Whereas, like, why is he born and having all these enjoyments, and then has renunciation, then goes? Is that the life itself is a pattern that emphasizes, that in a way, that pattern of life teaches something. I mean, sets it up to be able to teach the teachings, right? Renouncing this worldly pleasure and seeking enlightenment and so on.
Supreme role model.
So it's a role model. It's obedience in a way. But I don't think that the Earth has to look exactly the same. It's just these 12 deeds happen. So they have to be parents, though. It has to be a planet where there's parents and mom and dad and all that, right? Because it's birth from a womb. And that's different than a planet where, like, there's just like Amitabha, right? Where he's born from a lotus and then he just abides there, and he doesn't, he didn't have like those other some of these other steps. He didn't have to do that. So it's a different kind of emanation. And then the last of the four, I'll say this too. So if you differentiate into four, right, then the last one will be they call it sometimes the Jnana Dharmakaya, or the wisdom truth body, right? And that's actually I'll read the definition here from this one. The definition of the wisdom truth body is the final exalted wisdom consciousness perceiving all modes and varieties of objects of knowledge. So it's the omniscient mind of the Buddha, right? And actually, it says here the ornament for clear realization. So the Abhi Samaya Alamkara lists 146 exalted wisdom consciousnesses of this wisdom truth body. So it gives, so they actually list 146 different qualities or wisdoms or something like that of the wisdom truth body in Maitreya's Ornament for Clear Realizations. But so the reason why I mention that is that the 10 powers or the 10 strengths that Rinpoche taught is among those 146. So those come in a longer list. That's divided into all different things. What are they? The 10 forces, the 10 powers, the 4 fearlessnesses, the 9 absorptions, the 10 exhaustions, the 4 immeasurables, the 37 harmonies with enlightenment. There are many different qualities that are described of the wisdom truth body of the Buddha. And so the 10 powers, I'll call it, 10 strengths or 10 powers, are 10 among those qualities of the Buddha's wisdom truth body. And actually, Rinpoche went through them. Would it be useful to go through them again, what the 10 are, or do you guys feel like you got that yesterday? It's pretty clear. We don't, maybe, I'm not sure if that's useful or not.
Well, I have to see the
You can see it. That
YouTube again.
this is a bit different. It's obviously it's translated a little bit differently.
And the 10 were not really clear yesterday because we only got to 5, but somewhere there's another 5 or something.
You can say them.
Do you want me to go through them?
Yeah,
real
sure.
quick? Okay. So the first one, they each have like a title. Tashi was doing this yesterday. There's like a title for it and then a description of what it is. So the title of the first one, I'll just use this guy's translation because I think it had longer. Tashi was having to do it very quickly, whereas this translator had much more time. So the first one, they call it the power of knowing sources and non-sources. And what that means is that the Buddha perceives very perfectly, clearly, how negative karma is the source of all dissatisfaction and suffering, and how positive karma is the source of all happiness. And then the second one is the power of knowing the results of karma. And what that means is that the Buddha knows the precise cause of every result experienced by living beings and how they create the cause. And they say, right, this is a unique, only the Buddha can do it. Each of these, only the Buddha can do, right? And so they say, like, for example, that there are many stories like that, right? One is, they give one story, they say only a Buddha can know the color, why the color of each thing in a peacock's feather or something. But there are also those stories about, for example, there were stories where, like, when somebody came, like, who had very little merit and came during the time of the Buddha, and then other monks said, oh, we can't benefit him, but the Buddha knew the exact way to benefit that person because he could see their karma. Next is the power of perceiving the various inclinations of living beings. So it means like he can see the level of people's minds. He can see without error those inclined towards the what's it called? The lesser, individual liberation. Those inclined towards the Prajeka Buddha path, and those inclined to the Mahi. Next one is the power of knowing the various constituents of existence. So it says here, I'll just read it. The Buddha is alone in knowing all the countless universes and the various conditions in them. He knows both the gross and subtle elements and particles. Right? And that's related to what Rinpoche said about right, that the Buddha's wisdom pervades the entire universe. Right? So the Buddha knows all the universes. Next one, the power of knowing the higher and lower faculties of sentient beings. So it says here, the Buddha knows the measure of wisdom or other qualities possessed by each individual. He sees clearly the degree to which each is affected by any of the delusions. I'll make one quick comment on this point, like just because I've found it helpful sometimes, like so to share it, like Lama Zopa when talking about this kind of topic often points out, he says like, so he says actually this is why anybody other than a Buddha, even if we try to help others, we always sort of say our help could never be perfect, right? Because only a Buddha is capable of perfectly helping others, because the Buddha knows, right? He knows everybody's, or she, the Buddha knows everybody's perfectly knows everybody's potential, everybody's karma, your dispositions, your delusions, your positive potential, right? So the Buddha has a flawless ability to help. And so sometimes, like Lama Zopa pointed out, he said, like, somebody was saying, oh, I feel bad, I made a mistake. And the Buddha said, well, actually, like, if you think of, like, Arya Bodhisattvas on the high bhumis, they also make mistakes, right, in helping others. Like, in other words, they're not perfect. Compared to, like, their ability to help others is, like, infinite compared to ours. But compared to a Buddha, they still have, they don't have any flaws for themselves, but still they make mistakes in helping others because they don't know everything, right, that there is to know. And then he says, so, like, then if you go down, right, like then, like a third Bhumi Bodhisattva is not as capable as the second is not as capable as the first. The first, the third is higher than the second is higher than, in their ability to be helpful, right? They make fewer mistakes as you go up and up and up until a Buddha who makes no mistakes. And so then it was funny in a way, because then he said, then if you're on the path of accumulation, which is not yet at Arya Bodhisattva, then of course you make more mistakes. And if you're, and so on, if you keep going, and he said, then if you're an ordinary person, of course you're going to make a lot of mistakes, because we don't have anything like of that, like, sometimes like Atisha, right, there's a quote from Atisha where he said something like, if you don't have, which is not, the Buddha is omniscient, right? Atisha just said, if you don't even have clairvoyance yet, of course he said, like, then your ability to benefit others is so small, right? Like, if you can't read other people, like, if you can't read other people's mind, then you can only do so little benefit. Then somebody who has clairvoyance, they can benefit more, and then on up to a Buddha, right? I mean, the Buddha is much more than clairvoyance. He knows everything, right? Not just what somebody's thinking, but what their karma is, what their potentials are. He knows about somebody infinitely more than you know about yourself, right? You don't know what your karma is. You don't know the Buddha knows all those things, right? So anyway, you get the point there. I just thought that's one of the understandings of this, right? This is why the Buddha can flawlessly help others, right? Is that the Buddha has these omniscient mind, the omniscient mind with all these qualities. So the sixth one is the power of knowing all the paths. So it says the Buddha knows the appropriate path to every goal. So if your path, like, and that means partly, like, so if the person's goal, like, as the Buddha knows what the person's goals are, right? And then, like, if the person's goal is to achieve a good rebirth, then the Buddha knows how to help them to do that, right? If the person wants to achieve individual liberation, then the Buddha knows how to help them do that. If the person, so it's like the Buddha doesn't, what's the word? It's like the Buddha knows what you're aspiring for, and then can teach you the path of how to achieve that, right? So if somebody wants to achieve the path, it gives examples of the path we went through, the path of accumulation, of preparation, of seeing, of meditation, of no more learning. The Buddha knows all of those. And one thing, it says this in the Abhisamaya Alankara that this is taken from. It says there, right, that actually this is why the bodhisattvas, like, unlike other, like, if somebody's practicing the individual liberation vehicle, right, they just have to go through their own process of, their own path of accumulation, preparation, seeing, and so on. But then the bodhisattvas actually kind of have to learn all the paths, right, because they become a Buddha who then can teach all beings, right? So the bodhisattvas know all the paths to everywhere, right? So they know how to, they know the processes to go to different realms, and they know the process of that Pratyeka Buddha goes through. And it's said sometimes that they do the meditations, but then they don't take that result, right? Like, they know the path of a individual liberation, but because of their compassion, they don't go to that result, they go back, right? And they come back to samsara and continue benefiting sentient beings until they become a Buddha, so they know all the paths. Right? So that's one of it. It says that, this is from the Abhisamaya Alankara, and the Abhisamaya Alankara explains something about that. Then 7 is the power of knowing the meditative stabilizations, absorptions, liberations, and concentrations. And so it says the Buddha knows all the positive states of mind, such as faith, wisdom, compassion, and so on, that oppose the 84,000 delusions. He directly knows all the positive and negative states of mind without error. So it's clear, the Buddha knows all those. The 8th is the power of knowing previous lives. So the Buddha sees his own and all beings' past, present, and future rebirth. He knows the times each being has taken birth in any realm, their circumstances there, and when they will do so in the future. And so the Buddha knows the past and future rebirths, his or her own past rebirths, and then also others' past, present, and future births. Then 9th, the power of knowing death and rebirth. So it says the Buddha knows when and where each being will die, and when they will and where they will be reborn. So for a Buddha, it's not hard then to find tulkus, right? It becomes an easy job if you're a Buddha. But also, that's the thing where, like, right, like, it's, actually in the Abhisamaya Alankara, it says that even at a certain level, even Arya Bodhisattvas gain similar ability, where they can see beings where they took rebirth after they died, and of course then they have more ability to help, right? Because they know where their student, if they're a teacher, right, they know where their student took rebirth, and they can go benefit them from life to life. Whereas ordinary beings, we can't see them. We can't see where beings go after they die. So then, and then the 10th power is the power of knowing the extinction of the contaminations. So it says the Buddha sees all beings' final extinction of contaminations in their liberation, whether it be as a hearer, as a solitary realizer, or as a bodhisattva. And one thing, like Wilhelmina, you were implying this earlier, like one thing that's studying either the 10 powers or even all the 21 categories that include the 146 qualities of the Buddha, like one, I'll just make one comment, which is one benefit of that is like, when we take refuge, right, going back to like the Lam Rim, right, that in other words, the more we understand about the qualities of Buddha, then it's easier to have faith, in that, and then also to, as we say
To
it, like,
live it more practically.
yeah, so it helps with refuge, doesn't it? Like
Right.
refuge, you think, like, so that's why, sometimes like Ken Rinpoche, you guys have, many of you have heard this, like where Ken Rinpoche will talk about how, sometimes he gives these examples, right, where he talks about like Kadampa masters from the past, like, in the early times of, after, like the early 1100s or something. And I'll say like this person had the ability to, achieve like tantric cities or something like that. He said, but instead of doing that, they went and did practice of refuge. And sometimes you could say, well, sometimes you could think, well, why? If they could achieve some great thing, why would they practice refuge? But if you understand the meaning of refuge, right? Whereas like then, and the qualities of Buddha, then like Ken Rinpoche said, so what if you achieve some magical power? Who cares? Like that doesn't necessarily help you become enlightened. Whereas understanding the qualities of a Buddha and developing faith in that has much more benefit. So it was like, they said, compared to having some mundane achievement, there is developing an understanding. And this is like, for us, like we think in a very simple way, the Buddha, but if you study all these things, then you have like, what's to say it? Like then you could also feel that, the Buddha, like otherwise it could seem like, the Buddha was some person who lived,
Right,
like,
and
it
that
doesn't
doesn't mean too much. In the preliminary practices that I have to do, it always states those 10 also, but in a different way, and that always makes my heart jump.
Mhm.
And that's why I was so happy that it was addressed again more fully.
yeah, it gives more detail, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
I'll say I'll cover a few more quick, brief things while because I think we said we'd go just a little longer. But any questions about those parts? I thought just since we're reviewing, maybe I'll just say a few more things about stuff that Rinpoche said. Because again, I thought I'll just say a couple quick things. I think this was pretty clear yesterday, but so. Like I said, but the terms were maybe unfamiliar. Is Rinpoche talked about the 12, what Tashi called the 12 sense generators, and then the 18 dhatus. And those are just other, we actually have already covered those, they're just other labels, so in case you come across them when you're studying. Right, so the 12 sense generators, right, it's like, I think it's a good translation, but all that means, right, is that the 6 sense powers, right, and their 6 objects. Because in other words, you need, like, so the eye sense power at a visual object is 2, right? That's 2. Then the ear sense power and the sound is 2. Then the nasal sense power and smell. So you add up those, 6 and 6 is 12. That's 12 sense generators. So it's just another label for the 6 sense powers and their 6 objects. And then there was the thing. So that's just what I mean. Like we already covered the topic, but it's like if you don't make the connection, then you would think, oh, what are those, right?
But the 8 dhatus.
And then the 18 dhatus are just the so the 18 dhatus are just the same thing, but you add on 6 more things. So it's those same 12 plus the 6 consciousnesses, right? Because remember, the object, so far we'd only had physical things, right? The sense power
Right,
and the its object, right? Like sound and the ear sense power. That would make 12. If you add the 6 consciousnesses, right, the eye consciousness, ear, whatever, those 6, then you get 18 dhatus. So it's just another way of categorizing the same material we were already discussing. But again, it's useful because if you come across it, then you say, oh, what's that? As if you don't know it, but you've already studied it now.
right.
You have to know the terms. Or 18 dhatus, and right, and that's it. Dhatu means like what? Spheres.
That's okay.
Spheres. You could also call it that.
So
Dhatu spheres. 18 spheres.
Yeah.
And then
So generators, which word can you use instead of generators?
I would say I don't know the Sanskrit for that one, honestly. I'm not sure.
Generators, what else?
Might be. Is it? Might be Actually, I think I know you. I think it might be
Internet was
Ayutthaya.
good.
I think it's, I think I do know it, actually, I want to double check.
Fine.
Maybe it's in this book.
Oops.
The Sanskrit might be here. Doesn't include it. Yeah, I'm not 100% sure, and I don't want to guess, so if I don't see it, I could look it up later, so it must be in another book. So yeah, I'm not sure of the Sanskrit. And then, another thing Rinpoche said, so I'm just going through just points that he covered, just to clarify. Another one was, like, he said in this text, in the praise of Dharmadhatu, that Arya Nagarjuna differentiates beings into two categories, right? When he talks about, this is in verse 46, see how the mind has two aspects. It can be worldly or it can transcend the world. And so there, Arya Nagarjuna is differentiating samsaric beings from Buddhas. And then I think Rinpoche pointed out that in some other texts, they differentiate three levels. Like, so they would say ordinary beings, bodhisattvas, and Buddhas. So you could differentiate different ways. Oh, I left something out also. When we were talking about the, do you mind if I jump around just for a second?
No.
When we were talking about the four bodies of a Buddha, one thing I meant to say, because again, Rinpoche's covered this before, but just so it's, I don't know, clear or something, is actually, you could differentiate, sometimes they talk about that in different ways. So one way is, if you want to just say two categories, there's the Dharmakaya, which is the mind of a Buddha, and the Rupakaya, the body. So if you want to just categorize two things, then you would just say, there's the Buddha's mind and the Buddha's body. So the Rupakaya, Rupa meaning form, body, and Dharmakaya meaning truth body. That's, if you want to just keep it, that's the simplest classification. Then if you want to classify as three, right, then they sometimes will say there's the, and Tashi was talking this way sometimes, where he would say the Dharmakaya, the, which is the truth body, right, the Sambhogakaya, or the enjoyment body, and the Nirmanakaya, right, the emanation body. And then we did, then in the four, right, actually, when where we did the Svabhavikakaya and the wisdom truth body, those are taking the Dharmakaya and describing two different aspects of it, right? So then you would have four. So the other two are still the same, right? But if you're going to do three, it was those three, right? If you're going to do four, you still have the emanation bodies and the enjoyment bodies, right? So the Nirmanakaya and the Sambhogakaya. But then of the Dharmakaya, you could say the wisdom Dharmakaya and the nature body Dharmakaya. So you could just differentiate that into two more to make four instead of three. So I just want to clarify. So, because sometimes you'll hear like the three bodies of a Buddha, the four bodies of a Buddha, the two bodies but it's just different ways of categorizing. They aren't contradictory, right? Whereas if you say the Rupakaya, then you would differentiate that out into the Sambhogakaya and Nirmanakaya, right? So you could do it as one, just say the form body, or you can separate out and say there's the form, the emanation and the enjoyment form bodies. And the same thing with the Dharmakaya, you can just say the Dharmakaya, or you can differentiate. There's the nature body and the wisdom.
So the nature body and the truth body, what's the difference?
So in a sense, like one way of differentiating them, there are different ways you could talk about it. Here, I went through it, but one way of differentiating them is this: is that in this sense, the wisdom truth body, right? According to the definition I was reading here, right, where they said that the wisdom truth body. Yeah, I'll read the formal definition. So the formal definition of the wisdom truth body, right? This is in Sanskrit the Jnana Dharmakaya. is a final exalted wisdom consciousness perceiving all the modes and varieties of objects of knowledge. Makes sense? So that's the omniscient, right? It's omniscient, right? So and that has the 10 powers, or it has the 146 different wisdoms, understanding all phenomena. Whereas the definition of the nature body is an ultimate sphere possessing the two purities. One purity being pure of the object of negation, inherent existence, and also pure of defilements.
And also
is pure of all defilements. And so of all afflictions and all imprints of afflictions. So in that sense, it's like a... So one is sort of this, among the Dharmakaya. You could say that this is how I personally like the wisdom, right? Is the wisdom truth body is omniscient, right? So it's knowing all the conventionalities, whereas the nature body, in one sense, you could say it's the emptiness of that, of the mind that's free of all obscurity.
Also of the Dhammakaya.
Of the mind. Well, the way it's defined here is, it's pure of the object of negation, inherent existence, and it's also pure of all afflictive emotions and all obscurations.
so it's empty of.
It's empty. So it says here. Well, I'll just read you what it says because I don't want to say it wrong. It's empty. So it says. I'll read it again. The definition of the nature body is an ultimate sphere possessing two purities. The two purities are the purity of the object of negation, from the object of negation, inherent existence, and the purity from all adventitious defilements. And actually, one thing they talk about here, this is good. Maybe this is a clearer way to say what I was trying to say. Actually, this is a clearer way to say it. That even within the nature body, you can differentiate, according to the two purities, you can differentiate two different types of nature body. So the first is the naturally pure nature body. So that's an emptiness. Does that make sense? That naturally pure nature body is an emptiness, is the emptiness of that mind. And then you can say the second is the pure of adventitious defilements nature body. So that means pure of all afflictive emotions and their imprints. Does that make sense? So that's why I was sort of hesitant. Like one is actually you could say the nature body. You can actually describe it in two ways. One is sort of a conventionally exist. One is what's there to say? One is not an object of negation. It's not an emptiness. It's a mind that's pure of all defilements and afflictive emotions and their imprints. The other is an emptiness, right? So it's the emptiness of inherent existence of that mind. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's different from the omniscient mind, Buddha, right? Which is empty, but is not an emptiness.
It's empty, but it's empty.
And then, where's the other? A couple more things that I thought were good to cover. Okay, so just two more things now. So, like one is one I want to just mention because it came up in a number of contexts, and I've mentioned it a few times. But the people like I think we talked about it in the previous class, but I just want to make sure you were clear that when Rinpoche talked about that level on which you have those five qualities, and then you can perceive the Buddhas, right? And Rinpoche gave the example where you can see the statue talk, or like so. Just to clarify, right? So we break down the process of getting enlightened into 5 paths, right? If you're in the Bodhisattva practice, you break it down into 5 paths and 10 bhumis or grounds, right? And so the 5 paths, the first of the 5 paths, right? So the very beginning of I want to differentiate something too, just because it comes in the context of the Lamrim, right? That when let's say a person in the Lamrim, right? You're practicing Lamrim, and then you gain some level of realization of precious human life and impermanence. Right? And then and because you realize you have a precious human rebirth, and you understand impermanence, then you begin practicing Dharma, right? Where you start to give up on the affairs of this life. You become more concerned about future lives, right? And creating and avoiding negative karma and creating positive karma, right? At that point, you're practicing Dharma, right? You become a Dharma practitioner. Before that, you're not even a Dharma practitioner, right? If you just are mainly concerned with the things of this life, then they say that's not yet a Dharma practitioner, right? It's just somebody who maybe has an interest in Dharma, but you're not yet an actual practitioner, because to be a Dharma practitioner means you're more concerned with something spiritual, right? Something beyond just eating and sleeping and fame or reputation or comfort or something like that. If you're just mainly the teacher still would say that, right? If you're mainly concerned with comfort, then you're not different than an animal, right? Like animals are also concerned with being comfortable, so that's not a Dharma practitioner. And if you're just relating to Dharma to be comfortable, then that's just that doesn't differentiate you from the level that it's the same motivation, right, as a cat or a dog trying to be comfortable in the sunlight. And so that's not yet spiritual practice, right? It's not Dharma practice. But then if you realize those points and you start becoming more interested in creating positive karma to benefit your future lives, that's the very beginning of spiritual practice. So at that point, you're a Dharma practitioner. But you've not yet entered the path at that point, right? There is a path to enlightenment. You've not entered that at that time. And Ken Rinpoche pointed that out one time when he was teaching Lam Rim, and it's an important distinction, right? So at the level of the low scope, if you realize that, you've started practicing Dharma, but you're not yet entering the path. Right? And then, if you were a practitioner of the Theravada, right, or the individual liberation vehicle, then you enter the path, and by the way, it doesn't matter what tradition you're in, right? Just talking about the person. Doesn't mean if somebody could be wearing one color, just because somebody's wearing maroon robes, so they're from Tibet, doesn't mean they're Mahayana and they're internal. And just because somebody's from Sri Lanka and they're wearing yellow robes doesn't mean they're individual liberation, right? You can only tell from the person's inner mind, right? Because that's the definition of the paths, right? So somebody who's actually practicing the individual liberation vehicle, they enter the path, the actual path to their result, at the time when they actually generate renunciation. Right? And Lama Tsongkhapa in the Three Principles of the Path defines that, right? Where he talks about the definition of renunciation is where the person, like day and night, right, is longing for liberation and views ordinary samsaric existence like a prison, right? And they feel like a prisoner who's longing to get out. And given any moment, they would look for a chance to get out, right? That's the person who's entered the path to individual liberation. And then the person who's entered the path of the Mahayana, it comes at the time where they realize bodhicitta, right? So at the time when the person actually realizes bodhicitta, which cherishes others more than themselves, and continually, day and night, wishes for enlightenment for the welfare of all sentient beings, right? Then that person has entered the Mahayana path, right? So, we could be, it's interesting, right? We could be Mahayana Buddhists, in the sense that, we have faith in the Mahayana, and we read books about the Mahayana, and we go to teachings about, but to enter the Mahayana path, you have to have realized bodhicitta. So that's two different things, right? So you could say I identify myself as a Mahayana Buddhist, but I may not be actually on the path of Mahayana Buddhism yet, right? I could be aspiring to that, for example. It's possible, right? But then when somebody realizes bodhicitta, they enter the path of the Mahayana. So now I'm talking about Mahayana, okay, so I'll just describe that. So at the time when the person realizes bodhicitta, they enter the path of accumulation, the first of the five paths, right? So that's the entering the path on the path of accumulation. And then Rinpoche said, right, there's a small, they differentiate that into there's the small, the middling, and the great levels of the path of accumulation. And so just to clarify, the only reason I'm mentioning that is then Rinpoche said, it's at the great level of the path of accumulation that the person has that ability to see the Buddhas, right? So through their practice of bodhicitta and study, the main things that beings on the path of accumulation do, their biggest job, in a way, is to study and contemplate the teachings. So they study the teachings on, they're now realized bodhicitta, so they're studying the teachings on bodhicitta, they're studying the path of the great vehicle, they're studying how bodhisattvas progress, and they're also particularly studying emptiness, right? And then by studying and contemplating, they progress, right? And they develop their meditation ability. And on the great level of the path of accumulation, which Rinpoche mentioned, then they gain this ability to interact with statues and talk to them and see the Buddhas, and talk to Buddha emanations and visions, which you read many stories of bodhisattvas who did that. So they were at this level, then we would see, or higher. So, and actually, just to summarize, right, then after the great level of the path of accumulation, then one enters the second of the 5 paths, right, the path of preparation. So that's the second path. And then that has 4 levels. This is where the heat, peak. That's the third one. And then the last is supreme mundane dharma. What's the third one?
Patience.
What's that?
Patience.
Patience, yeah.
Right.
Heat, peak, patience, or forbearance, and then supreme mundane.
Take
Heat.
it.
Yeah, like they're heating up. Their practice is really heating up.
What's the last one?
Supreme mundane dharma.
What's the?
That's the one right before realizing emptiness directly. That's why it's called supreme mundane dharma, because it's the one right before the non-mundane dharma of realizing emptiness directly. We call it like that.
So
Heat, peak,
Peak?
yeah, like top. Then patience or forbearance, and then supreme mundane dharma.
so when you haven't realized emptiness is mundane.
Yeah, you're still
then-
mundane.
So when you realize,
Then you're noble, right?
Noble.
Arya, noble. So those are the first 2 paths, right? Those are still ordinary beings in the sense they're not Aryas yet. And then the third path, after the path of, and preparation, you can see the word, you're preparing to see emptiness directly. And actually, I'll just say one thing, the way you enter, the difference between the path of accumulation and preparation is to enter the path of preparation, that person has to already have bodhicitta, of course, right? Because they had that when they were on the path of accumulation. But the differentiating point is at that time, the person has gained calm abiding, unified with special insight. They haven't seen emptiness directly yet, but they have with a conceptual understanding. So they conceptually understand emptiness, and they can meditate on that with calm abiding, with shine. That was what Rinpoche was talking about yesterday, right? Shine or shamatha, calm abiding meditation. Right, so they've achieved, and so they've achieved that thing. Remember, shine comes with that thing called bliss and pliancy, right? Or Wilson called it supreme ease or something. But this time it's translated bliss and pliancy of calm abiding. And at that time, like the person, those are the people they already have, like, so they can concentrate their mind as long as they want on any object, right? And they also have that bliss and pliancy, like they have a very light feeling. They don't get tired. They don't get fatigued. Their body is changed in a way through that concentration. So even their physical body kind of is different at that point. And there's beings like that who don't need, they have different ways of relating to. They're different than ordinary people already, but they're not yet an Arya. Yet, I mean, Aryas also have this, but at this point you're not an Arya, right? When you've achieved the path of preparation. So anyway, when you go through those 4 levels of the path of accumulation, then the point where you go from the path of accumulation to the next path, so the third path is the path of seeing. And the particular feature of that is that's where one first realizes emptiness directly. So one has a direct realization of emptiness at the path of seeing, and that's the entrance. So at the path of seeing also, one enters the first bhumi, the first ground, which is called it's in this text. It's called the very joyful ground. It comes later. We didn't get up to that point. So on the path of seeing, one achieves the very joyful ground, or the joy. And I think I think somebody said, I think I read that somewhere. That it's called very joyful because they're very happy, right? That they finally realized emptiness directly. It must be a big relief. So that's the first ground, right, on the path of seeing. Then the fourth path, which Rinpoche mentioned this, right? He actually mentioned all these. Then the fourth one is the path of meditation. That's the fourth of the 5 paths. And on that path, right, one goes through the all the other bhumis, right? There are 10 bhumis, so one progresses from bhumi to bhumi, right? 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, up to the 10th bhumi. I think it says in here, it's called clouds of Dharma. And then the final path is the path of a Buddha, right? Is the goal actually, which is they call it the path of no more learning, right? Where there's nothing else to learn. So those are the 5 paths, right? And this text in the Nagarjuna earlier in the part that Rinpoche covered last time, and also in the part that comes later, not in the part that Rinpoche covered yesterday, it says that those 5 paths and 10 bhumis are the process through which like they gave the analogy, right? Rinpoche gave the analogy of like a Buddha statue wrapped up in a bunch of dirty rags, as like our Buddha nature is covered in the afflictions, right, and the obscurations to knowledge. So in a sense, those 10 bhumis are like the process of taking the rags off, right? And by the end, all that's left is the golden Buddha statue. Or Rinpoche gave another, Nagarjuna actually, and Rinpoche taught it the previous time. Nagarjuna gives another analogy. It's like if you have a brilliant light inside like a completely obscured at first by a vase or something like that. Then he said the first, at the point of the first bhumi, it's like you punch your first hole, right? You've got like a chisel, and you knock a hole so that some light starts to come out. And then the path of, from there, through the path of meditation, you keep poking holes. Right? Until by the path of no more learning, all that's left is light, and the enclosing vase is completely destroyed. So that's like metaphors from this text about that process of the 10 bhumis. So that's how you reveal your Buddha nature, right? Is through those practices of especially the Arya grounds.
I have a question. How come the Hinayana they're able to realize the liberation where they don't get to do the 6 perfections? Because you have to perfect all the 6 perfections, right?
Yeah. So they don't have to perfect the 6 perfections because the 6 perfections are a unique practice to become a Buddha. So that's a unique practice of the Bodhisattvas.
Mm-hmm.
So like a Prajeka Buddha, right, or what we call solitary realizer, or a hearer, right, Shravaka. They don't. They're not. Their goal is not. Remember how we said like the Buddha knows each. One of the 10 powers is the Buddha knows each being's wish and also the path or the goal, the method to achieve their goals.
Yeah.
So like for a person who's, let's say a person's a hearer, like their lineage, their goal is individual liberation. Right? So then the issue is for that person, if their goal is just to achieve their own liberation from samsara, they don't have the goal of benefiting all sentient beings infinitely. So then if that's not their wish, then the Buddha teaches them, and they don't have that disposition, right, and that tendency, then for that person, the Buddha teaches them a path that doesn't include the 6 perfections because they don't need that to achieve that goal. In other words, the Buddha knows the methods to achieve each goal, right? So the 6 perfections are to achieve the goal of Buddhahood. For that person, they don't need those 6 perfections because they're not trying to achieve that goal. What they need are the 3 higher trainings.
Yeah.
So they need ethics, concentration, and wisdom, understanding emptiness. Right? So they need those 3, mainly, that's the main topic. So then the Buddha teaches those things to that person, and they achieve that goal. So they don't need to practice the 6 perfections, at least at that time, because they don't have that goal at that time. Does that make sense?
So the final goal is a nirvana state?
The final goal, it depends on following up on his point then, in a way, ultimately, right, from the Mahayana point of view, the final goal is Buddhahood, actually, right? Full enlightenment. Which sometimes is called non-abiding nirvana. They sometimes label it that way. So that would be the final goal. But some people, some practitioners have a provisional goal or a temporary goal of their own enlightenment. It's said different Buddhist schools have different views on that. But Nagarjuna's school, the middle way school, their view is that all beings eventually become Buddha. So from their perspective, if somebody has some schools like the mind-only school of Buddhism, they say that some people just achieve, their own individual nirvana, and then they kind of don't ever become a Buddha. The middle way school says that eventually that being will become a Buddha, that the Buddhas will sort of wake them up and say, hey, you have to keep going. That's the middle way school's view. So from the middle way school's perspective, everyone eventually has to become a Buddha. So that would be the goal.
So there will be no reverse.
In that sense, if you're a Buddha, you have those 4 bodies, right, of a Buddha. So in that sense, you're already you have the Dharmakaya, then you have this body of complete enjoyment that's in a pure land forever until the end of samsara. And you don't really take rebirths, but they say you send out emanations everywhere, right? So it's not like rebirth, it's like you send emanations to benefit beings that are just sort of effortless. They say the Buddha has no conceptual thoughts and has no ability, it can't suffer, right, but just sort of sends out emanations to benefit. So it's not like rebirth. They don't take rebirth. They emanate.
So what's the difference between then individual liberation and the Buddha? What's more complete?
So the Buddha, the difference is this: is that if a person has achieved individual liberation, right, or sometimes called personal nirvana or individual liberation, that person has through a combination of grounded in ethics, right, and then through their practice of meditative concentration and wisdom, they've eliminated, understanding emptiness correctly, right? They've ceased and destroyed their own ability to give rise to all afflictive emotions. So they don't give rise anymore to anger, desire, pride, jealousy, any afflictive emotion. And for that reason, that person stops taking samsaric rebirths and doesn't suffer. They're free from suffering. But at that point, that person just sort of, from the middle way school's perspective, that person then just sort of, he's almost like abides in a kind of peace, individual peace. But there are a number of big differences. One is that that person doesn't benefit others then. Like, they don't emanate. Like the Buddha sends, we're talking about how the Buddha, in the Sambhogakaya is benefiting the Arya Bodhisattvas, then is sending out these various emanation bodies to benefit all kinds of beings. So that one is that the person who achieved individual liberation doesn't do that activity. Like, so they don't, they have their own, from their own side, they're not suffering, but they're not, they're not benefiting others in that way. And then another difference is that although they say that another difference, which we talked about a little bit, but just to clarify, is that like both a Buddha and a Arhat, I'll call that would be an Arhat, right? An individual foe destroyer. Both they're having same in the sense that they both eliminated their own afflictive emotions, but a Buddha has also cultivated other things. So one is a Buddha has eliminated all the obscurations to knowing. So a Buddha is omniscient. A Buddha knows all phenomena, whereas the individual person doesn't know all phenomena. Another is that the Buddha has completed all good qualities. Which, and an example of that is that, they say, for example, that this is one of the main differences, is that somebody who's on the individual liberation path, they do have love and compassion, but it's not. It's not. They don't cultivate that to the same degree that a bodhisattva does, and so that's a major difference. It's so there comes a point where a bodhisattva could achieve their own liberation, but they have such deep, extreme compassion for the suffering of others that they say, I want to emanate endlessly to benefit others because of my love and compassion for others. Whereas the person on the path of the individual liberation does have some degree of love and compassion for sure, but when they think, oh, would I want to emanate endlessly, it seems like there's some kind of disposition to say that seems too difficult, or I don't know, some feeling that they don't have that sense, the level of compassion that says I would happily, like the Dalai Lama's prayer, right? For as long as sentient beings remain, for as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remains, may I too remain to benefit the world. That came from Shantideva. That's the prayer of a bodhisattva, right? This sense of my prayer, my aspiration, my wish, I would be happy to emanate endlessly and infinitely for all beings. That kind of wish, the person on the individual liberation, the person who sort of is inclined towards and is practicing that path doesn't have that unique kind of level of extreme
responsibility too.
and responsibility.
Is it possible to reach that state kind of accidentally,
Which state?
where you're in the nirvana, the personal nirvana, but not a Buddha? Because there's been a lot of talk about misunderstanding when you've really understood emptiness. Is it possible to go into some kind of calm, abiding meditation or something and kind of, I don't know, get stuck there? Like you're just blissful and happy and sort of forget about helping others? Or I don't know what it's like.
Well, it's important to differentiate. I want to differentiate two different things, though, just to make sure it's
Okay.
clear. One is there's a big difference between a calm, abiding meditation, right? That's blissful, and the bliss of understanding emptiness, for example, or the bliss of individual liberation or something. Those are different, first of all, because they're definitely very different. Because what's there to say? Because calm, abiding meditation, for example, one is achieved long before one realizes. One has to achieve that before one realizes emptiness, for example. But then, okay, so that's one thing to differentiate.
Okay.
But then within that differentiation, yes, if one doesn't, that's why, if one hasn't actually realized bodhicitta, right, then yes, for sure, right? And there are stories like in, I thought this maybe was a sad but funny story. There's a story of where somebody said that there was a tantric practitioner, actually, of the Vajra Tantra, right, in Tibet at the time, who, and then somebody came to Atisha, and somehow, I don't know, was it Atisha knew, or the person knew, that the person had, hadn't practiced bodhicitta, right, and it was, even though they were, like, labeled, that's why I was an example, they were labeled Mahayana, right, because Tantra is technically a branch of Mahayana, right, so they were labeled a Mahayana practitioner, but they weren't actually on the path of Mahayana, because they hadn't realized bodhicitta, but they had realized renunciation. And so what happened was that person achieved their own individual nirvana, actually. Through that technique, they just achieved their own peace, right? And somebody said, somebody said to Atisha, isn't that sad that the person, could have, they had the techniques to, like, they were a good meditator, and so if they had realized bodhicitta, they could have become a Buddha, And then Atisha said, oh, well, actually many people who are labeled that are actually, will actually go to lower realms, because they don't even have they don't even have a good motivation. They're doing that out of some kind of desire and anger or something. He said, then they'll just go to, he said, so that's, at least they didn't go to lower realms or something. And there are stories like that of people who supposedly were practicing Mahayana but actually didn't have that motivation. So the key is the motivation. So in other words, but if somebody actually practices bodhicitta really and does the techniques, the 7-point cause and effect method, or the equalizing and exchanging self for others, the lojong, mind training of that, and then one realizes bodhicitta, then it's not possible, because the power of the bodhicitta itself is what, whereas it's not like an intellectual thought, oh, it'd be nice. It's the realization of bodhicitta that actually, like, that person couldn't do that. And it's because of the power of the bodhicitta motivation, that motivation itself causes them to come out of those samadhis. So they achieve, like, incredibly blissful samadhis, right, the bodhisattvas, but the power of their bodhicitta, that's a real realization, is their main, what's the word to say it, like, it's like His Holiness, right, that sense of the purpose of the existence. That's what he's teaching all the time. The purpose of that person's existence is to be a benefit to others, so then they don't, that's what causes them to come back, towards benefiting others. So I think the main thing that there is according to that story from Atisha, it would be possible if the person sort of, like, I would imagine, right, that person probably said the prayer of bodhicitta, I'm just my own guess, right, but they didn't do the meditations to cultivate bodhicitta. They just said, may I be of all being, they might have said, like, the Sangye or something like that, but they didn't actually cultivate bodhicitta motivation. So then, of course, for that person, when they achieve some kind of bliss, they might get attached to it. So yeah, but if you realize bodhicitta, then it's not possible.
One more question. So what happens to the individual liberator then, if the middle ways views that they'll eventually become a Buddha? How do they do that without rebirths?
There's some, like, again, like, different schools are a little different in their stance on this, but some people say that, like, that being will sort of abide in the state of individual liberation for a long period of time, of course not helping others during that time, but that then, like, because the Buddha knows, right, in the 10 powers, right, the Buddha knows the dispositions of beings and knows the right timing, and knows that sort of, like, there's some teaching to say that at a certain time the Buddha will know that, like, due to some previous inclinations when they were still a sentient being or suffering, like, that there will come a time where it's the right time, and that then, like, the Buddhas will emanate just for that person, and will somehow, I can't imagine quite what it's like, but somehow will relate to them and say, now is the time to practice the 6 perfections, and now is the time to begin practicing generosity, and so that person has already realized emptiness. So they don't go backwards in a sense of to suffering or something like that, but they have to begin from the beginning in terms of all those practices of giving and patience and the other perfections in order to progress through the bodhisattva levels.
And that would be, like, within that lifetime, potentially.
I don't know. Actually, I guess it could make many lifetimes at that point.
Yeah.
Like, it could be thousands or millions of years later. I don't. It could be. I don't know how long they abide in that. So it could be many, long time later, and then it could take them eons and eons. It probably would take. According to the Buddhist view, it would take eons for that person then to actually eventually become a Buddha.
But they wouldn't. But they were liberated just from the afflictions, but not from the rebirth.
No, they were liberated, so they don't take samsaric rebirth anymore.
Oh.
Yeah. So they would have to kind of, like, through the blessings of a Buddha and through prayers, somehow, like, emanate or take some kind of, not a samsaric rebirth, but take some kind of body in order to practice generosity, right? Because you have to have a body to give stuff away. So they would have to do that logically, I would think. Sort of take some sort of bodily form in order to be generous. So I'm not sure quite how they do that. That's what it says, that the Buddhists sort of know the timing and come to them. kind of awaken them from their samadhi. And it's tricky because they don't go backwards to suffering, and they don't stop realizing emptiness, but they have to sort of begin all those other practices. And it's said to take a long time. And I guess we were going to stop. I'll say one last. Okay, so the last thing, and then we'll stop. Is just remember that. So the last thing I just want to mention is again that Rinpoche said. So on that level, right, of the great level of the path of accumulation, I just want to mention this, right, that the Buddha said one has those 5 qualities, right? Faith. Rinpoche said this yesterday. Faith, mindfulness, aspiration, concentration, and wisdom. And so I just thought we could end with those 5 qualities that and so the Buddha, the Buddha, Khenpo Rinpoche, the Buddha said that that the first of those is faith, right? And there's actually a line, I think it's in the I don't remember if it's in a sutra or in one of the commentaries, but it says like, but Rinpoche I think could paraphrase that, where it said like the faith is like a mother that gives birth in a sense to these other qualities, and that's true in a way. Like I'll just make a comment on that. That's like the conclusion today. So Rinpoche said that, right, that one has to have faith in order to give rise to these other qualities, and that's true. And Rinpoche one time, actually it's in the Easy Path book, where Rinpoche taught about this, where he said we shouldn't think, he said we don't have to think of faith as something like unfamiliar, or something like that. And then he said like, it's like faith is where faith leads to aspiration actually. I should do it in the opposite order. Faith, aspiration, mindfulness, concentration, wisdom. And he gave the example, he said like, he gave the example of like shopping, right? Like, which I thought was very funny. Like, if you go to the mall or something, like, and I was thinking like this, like there was that's what you say it, like for a car, right? Like there is like at first, if you just heard the name of some new car, you don't think anything, right? But then, like if you start hearing when Prius first came out, I don't know, or some other car, right? Like somebody says, I don't know what that is. Like, and then, but then if you start hearing qualities of that, I'm just giving you an example. We have a car, right? Where somebody says, oh, this car gets really good gas mileage, also it has good pickup, also it's very comfortable. Then like somebody says, oh, they have a good deal on it, it's not too expensive, oh, they last really long, and look, here's a Consumer Reports thing, it's like really, So then like, if you hear many different good things about it, right, then you see some commercial and people are smiling a lot, and they're driving it or something, then like slowly you might have some feeling of like, oh, I bet you might feel like, oh, that's probably a really good car. Then if your friend buys it and they say, oh, I had a very good experience, like I've been driving this one, and, like I'm at over 100,000 miles and it's still going great. I love it. I don't have to spend any money on fixing it, and it's great. Then you start to go, oh, I want to get one. Then like you start thinking, when my car breaks down, I want to get one of those. Maybe I'll trade it in, right? Like that's aspiration, right? Already. So in other words, Rinpoche said that. He said like, so faith is like you hear the good qualities of something, right? Then you develop some faith. Oh, that's good. I think that's a really good thing, right? And then when faith leads naturally to aspiration, we start thinking, if you think enough that something's good, then you start wanting it. Of course, this is a samsaric example, is the problem. but Rinpoche is giving us some samsaric example because we're more familiar with that, right? So he explained it that way. Then he said it's the same thing with this, right? This process. So with faith, right, that you keep hearing the qualities of realizing emptiness, right? You keep hearing the good qualities of the paths. You keep hearing good qualities of the result of Buddhahood, right? And at first, like when somebody first says it, you might think, okay, like, all right, yeah, whatever, that's cool, right? And then like if you keep hearing them and thinking about them, right? Then eventually you start to develop some feeling of like, wow, that's really something valuable, right? Like the car, in this case it's like emptiness realization, right? Like you study enough teachings by Nagarjuna that you start to say, wow, wouldn't that be amazing to realize emptiness? Wouldn't that be like, I would start getting actually rid of my afflictions and I would achieve all these abilities and I could help others so much and wow, I can like do this and that, like you start to understand all these different benefits, right? That's like faith, right? And you have some faith, oh, the result of Buddhahood with 10 powers? Wow, that'd be amazing, right? You heard like when Lama Zopa Rinpoche teaches, he goes, wow, wow, wow,
Yes.
wow, 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 wow. He keeps going, wow. He keeps saying it over and over. Like it's like this, he's trying to develop faith, right? He keeps like, so amazing. He's just like that. Right? But he's talking about this kind of faith, right? It's like the faith of like, it's not like some kind of, I think sometimes we can have some ideas like faith is something like going like that, which it might be, but the idea is faith is a state of mind, right? Like of thinking, oh, that's so amazing, it's so great, like, and Rinpoche was saying that way, like, because we have that for like cars and phones and houses or something, right? But if you think enough about the qualities of something, that's how you develop faith, right? You think of the good qualities of it. So if you have to think a lot about the qualities of realizing emptiness, the quality of bodhicitta, the quality, then you develop faith by like seeing all these benefits, right? And then you start to have naturally aspiration. Faith leads, that's why he said it's like the mother that leads to that, right? So if you develop enough faith, right, like that, of seeing the benefits, then you start to naturally aspire, right? Like, oh, I want that. And then if like the more your faith grows, the more you want that thing. And then the faith naturally leads, right, to mindfulness, right? That you don't forget. Like, you know, it's like mindfulness means you don't forget your goal in a way, right? That you're like getting more and more aware, right? Mindfulness means also like remembering, like and keeping it in mind, right? So you start to have more and more like mindfulness of emptiness, for example, right? Or of bodhicitta, or of the goal of enlightenment, right? And then through mindfulness, if you keep remembering your goal, then naturally you develop concentration, right? In other words, concentration is not so hard to develop if you've been mindful already, right? If you're always like holding in mind what your goal is, and you're thinking more and more about, let's say, emptiness, right? So you're thinking about it, and thinking about it, thinking about it. Then when you sit down to meditate, it's much more easy, right, to develop concentration. And also you have all that behind you, this strong faith and strong motivation. And so for that person, that's actually when you study the teachings on developing calm abiding, right? A lot of the obstacles are overcome through mindfulness, aspiration, and faith, right? Because when you, in other words, if you really know the benefits of something, then it's easier to concentrate on it. And also then you have the energy to concentrate on it. And then through concentration you develop the wisdom. Right? In other words, you use that concentration to analyze and develop wisdom, understanding the difference between, for example, Rinpoche gave the example between the wisdom distinguishing true existence and the lack of true existence, right? You develop those kinds of wisdom, all these kinds of wisdom, and you can see how that naturally leads to all the good qualities, right? And then Rinpoche said that all the good qualities come naturally if you have those 5. But we can't, like if we say, okay, I want to immediately develop concentration, actually it won't work, right? You have to first focus on developing faith that understands the benefits, you know, and then through that, you develop the others, and it goes in, like, kind of, they flow naturally. Does that make sense? So that's why, remember, she said it's like the mother, right? He said that. So you can see how faith is, that's how faith is like the mother, is that it leads to the other ones. So that's something, I just want to end with that, because that's something we can do now, right? Is we can contemplate these benefits, and that of like what Rinpoche taught, then we can develop aspiration, and then we can progress, and then we can all achieve like that level, right? Where you can all become the great path of accumulation and start talking to statues.
You say like subject, object, what?
What's that?
Subject and object,
Or what?
like path of, that they have to be together.
Subject,
Dualistic,
noun, yeah.
dualistic.
Subject, noun, like, so until you, I guess like, I think until you achieve the path of seeing, actually, like, it's always you'll always have some degree of dualism.
Okay.
But then if you achieve the path of seeing, it's non-dualistic. That is, once that level, then you don't have it's a non-dualistic wisdom.
Yeah.
But let's just do let's just do those 2 prayers. Danju, Sanju, Rinpoche, Magavana, Kibushu, Kirvanya, Magavaya, Onya, Onya, Gana